You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Welcome to True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time.
Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared bin Laden.
You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position?
Vengeance felt good. Seeing these people pay for what they'd done felt righteous.
True Spies from Spyscape Studios, wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, this is Jenny.
And Jen from Ancient History Fangirl.
And this is Vercingetorix, All You Love Must Burn, all in one place.
One place!
I picked this series because, well, first, this episode is a whole divided into 3 parts. And if there's any series in our back catalog that's perfect for this whole rabbit hole thing we're doing, it's this one. And second, I love this series because it talks about the deadly Battle of Alesia and everything that led up to it. Julius Caesar's genocide of the Gauls and everything they did to defend themselves. They threw everything at the Caesar problem. Everything they had, everything they loved. They burned their crops and destroyed their own cities and abandoned their families and loved ones and made really horrible choices until in the end it was hard to tell who the bad guys and the good guys were because that's what war does to people. And it's a terrible story, but it's also an important story and not one that's told in its entirety as often as it should be.
I think one of the things about this episode that I'm so glad Jenny chose to pick it is I didn't know this story. This is a corner of history, particularly ancient history, that was so new to me. Like, I didn't know about Alesia. I didn't know anything about Julius Caesar's genocidal conquest of the Gauls. And hearing this story and making sure other people hear this story really helps solidify what it was like to live during the Roman Republic, what the Roman war machine looked like, and how it created the people that eventually became the Romans, and what it did to the people who came up against them.
Yeah, and I do feel like when we talk about Julius Caesar and the Gauls, a lot of the time, you know, when I see documentaries about this or read things about it, the major focus is often on Alesia, the Battle of Alesia, the final battle, and how brilliant Julius Caesar was in all the siege works and booby traps he built and everything like that, and what a great commander he was. It's rare to find an account that focuses on the details of what went on before that and the real human sacrifices and struggles and decisions that the Gauls were faced with and had to make and what they had to do to save their country, their culture, and their way of life. And we really tried to represent that in this series of episodes. And it's not one of the light and fun episodes because it does deal with genocide. And if you listen to the 2 Julius Caesar episodes that we did before this, then you're about to have the rug ripped out from under you. You will not like Julius Caesar after this at all.
And that's the point. And that's why we dropped them in this order, too.
Exactly. But it's such an important story, and one of the interesting things about it is that our main source on this was an eyewitness. It was Julius Caesar. Of course, not a trustworthy eyewitness because he was the conqueror and his commentaries were propaganda, specifically written to be read aloud in the town squares all across the city of Rome and bolster his image. We try to pick through that as best we can in this episode with varying degrees of success, I would say.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that it is one of those things to remember about who gets to tell the story and how we, as students of history, as people from the future, look at that story, break it down, and understand what happened. Because the truth is in there somewhere.
So here's the entire file, all in one place, for your listening enjoyment. We hope you have a great summer, and we'll be back September 22nd. Caesar was in Gaul to stay, and he believed he could do anything to anybody. Gaul is a whole divided into 3 parts. Gaul is a whole divided into 3 parts. Gaul is a whole divided into 3 parts. At first, we do nothing. A tribal dispute with our southern neighbors. A migration unasked for. We see you use permission as pretext. Some among us choose sides. Others stay distant. watching. But the season turns. We see you chase down the migrating tribesmen. By now, it's not just the warriors. It's women and children run into the ground. Still, most of us hold back, keep our counsel, and protect our own. Your numbers multiply. Soon you're pouring over the mountains and spreading across the countryside like flies over a corpse's body. You pursue us into the freezing marshes of the northern wastes, and you pursue us to the high cliffs that border the iron sea. You harry us through the fields of summer wheat and the groves of whispering oak. By the second spring, the front is everywhere. We fight you in the fords, knee-deep in the blood of our countrymen. We fight you in the blooming pastures where we once laid down with our wives. Standing on the piled-high corpses of our brothers and fathers, we catch the enemy's spears and hurl them back in the enemy's faces. Still, you come. We hide ourselves behind high walls, and you crack our cities like rocks between a giant's teeth. With our own flesh and bone, we stand in the breaches. With our bare hands, we hurl fire at the siege engines. Still, you come on. You roll right over us, plow right under us. By the thousands, you take our women and children into slavery and drive us into the ground. In ancient times, there was honor in warfare. Our ancestors fought in single combat, defended their names with battle hymns on their lips. But there is no honor in this. You turn us against each other with subterfuge and subtlety. Brother against brother, you turn us. There is nothing in the end we can defend. We flee to the last of our strongholds, setting fires as we go. Our beautiful cities, the homes we were born in, the fields of summer wheat where once our children played as the sun set, the ancient oak forests where our druids harvested mistletoe, the forests that kept our secrets. If we want to live, everything we love must burn. Take our broadswords, take our rumbling chariots of war, our valiant horses, our sturdy cattle, take our great war trumpets, break them and bury them in the deep of the deepest pits. No longer may the hills ring with their battle songs, no longer may we sing our paeans. Take our stories, take the heroes whose tales we told beneath the rafters of our mead halls, take our gods who stood as smoke against you, take the gold offerings piled high in the sacred groves, parade them through your city, then melt them into coins to commemorate your victory. Take our bones to pave the streets of Rome. Take our blood to feed the ambition of Caesar. Burn our hearts in your braziers. Make us ash and dust and one with our dismembered country. Take all that we were, our myth and our memory. Divide us into three parts: the dead, the enslaved, and the Romanized. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl.
So in the past few episodes, we started with the first half of the life of Caesar. We looked at his early political career and motivations and took a deep dive into the political element in which he swam.
Then we took a close look at the Gauls, who they were and what made them tick, based on Gallic archaeology, the records of other Mediterranean writers, and an ancient Celtic epic from Ireland that may have been based on older tales from Gaul.
And now we're finally sending Caesar and his army on a collision course toward the people of Gaul. This was an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, the disciplined might of the Roman Empire coming up against an epic warrior culture that had existed in this place for centuries. Only one would emerge alive.
So let's get on with the story.
Caesar, as we discussed a few episodes ago, had reasons for invading Free Gaul. He had just been made governor of both Cis and Transalpine Gaul. He needed cash. He needed to get it without plundering his governorships because those optics were bad. Because, as we've said before, Caesar made his reputation by prosecuting people who plundered their governorships. He was the non-corruption candidate, and he couldn't be seen to, now be corrupt.
But the thing is, Caesar was really in debt.
He was really in debt, and this was dire straits, because if you went into debt in ancient Rome and couldn't pay back your creditors, one of the things that could happen to you was you could be sold into slavery. Caesar also needed a big victory to boost his popularity and insulate him against his political enemies. And as we said, he needed money, because he'd put himself deep in debt to secure his political victories. If he didn't win in Gaul and didn't win another political position right away when his governorship ended, Caesar stood to lose everything: his career, his estates, and even his freedom. The stakes for Julius Caesar were very high.
Gaul was Rome's traditional enemy, the scary bedtime story that had frightened Roman children since the first sack of Rome in 390 BC, and Caesar knew the tribes north of Transalpine Gaul weren't strongly allied. Free Gaul was ripe for the picking. So, in 58 BC, as soon as he came into his governorship, Caesar immediately started looking for an excuse to invade to the north of Transalpine Gaul, into the areas of Gaul not already controlled controlled by the Romans, which at this point was most of France, up into Belgium, a little bit of Germany. It wasn't extremely well defined, but that's the general area. Because, remember, Caesar needed public support back home. His war had to look justified. And a free Gallic tribe called the Helvetii played right into his hands.
The Helvetii wanted to migrate, and its leaders petitioned Caesar to let them pass through Roman-controlled areas of Gaul peacefully. This was a fairly routine request, but instead of granting it, Caesar manufactured some outrage. Wasn't it true that this very tribe killed a Roman consul back in 107 BC, 7 years before Caesar was born? So Caesar's 42, so we're talking over 50 years ago. Didn't this tribe attack a consul back, 50 years in the past? Didn't their chieftain Vercingetorix have a documented agenda of making himself ruler of Gaul? And wouldn't their planned route take them through the territory of the Aedui, a tribe who was allied to Rome? Caesar could not just let a known aggressor wander around an allied territory unsupervised. That wouldn't be right.
Heaven forfend.
So when the Helvetii asked for permission to cross Roman territory, Caesar told them no. He stalled them for 2 weeks while he had his troops build fortifications and destroy bridges to keep them from crossing a river they needed to cross. And when they found an alternate route, Caesar harassed them for months in a campaign that wound up killing 2/3 of all men, women, and children in the Helvetii tribe.
Meanwhile, about 4 years before Caesar became governor, one Gallic tribe, the Sequani, had invited a Germanic tribe, the Suebi, to help them fight the Aedui, that Gallic tribe allied to Rome. So the Suebi were basically Germanic mercenaries. The Suebi defeated the Aedui as they were hired to do and then subjugated them. And then they turned around and did the exact same thing to the Sequani, the tribe that they were supposed to be fighting for. For the past 4 years, the Suebi had been tyrannizing both Gallic tribes. Their king, Ariovistus, was known for his arbitrary cruelty. I mean, we should introduce these guys to the Carthaginians.
I was just thinking that.
It's like the worst client ever meets the worst contractor ever.
Oh my God, this is how they wound up with the Death Star.
This is why there's a hole in the Death Star. It's the Carthaginians and the Suebi working together.
So we've now solved a massive plot hole in Star Wars. I mean, forget about Rogue One.
Yeah, the real story is just the Suebi and the Carthaginians. Worst contractor ever. Worst client ever.
There's not enough Cheetos in the world.
Cover them all in Cheeto dust. What does that even mean? I don't know. I'm just going to keep going. Let's forge ahead. And for the past 4 years, helping the Aedui had not been a Roman priority, even though the Aedui were their allies and they were supposed to help out when stuff like this happened. Vercingetorix, a druid of the Aedui tribe, had traveled to Rome a few years ago to beg the Senate for help. The Senate had brushed him off and then had the gall to declare Ariovistus a friend of Rome for some reason. I don't know why. Just to rub it in, right?
That's what I'd do.
Because you're a chode bag. That's what the warp spasm voice would do, because the warp spasm voice doesn't give a shit.
No, the warp spasm voice is on the side of the druids.
Cucullin, is that you?
Yes, it is I, Cucullin.
Are you going to read the rest of the episode?
Only if you'll have me.
I totally will.
This is where I shall plant my sword.
What are we doing?
I don't know. We need to be recording. Why are we fucking around?
Cucullin, will you stop distracting me? I'm trying to tell a story here. So suddenly, this was priority number 1 for Caesar. Roman allies were being oppressed. This could not be borne. He finished up grinding the Helvetii under his heel and then marched to the rescue of the Aedui. Finally, somebody cares what is happening with the Aedui.
The druid, Vercingetorix, who traveled to Rome to try to get help for the Aedui, had given Caesar a heartbreaking account of Ariovistus' cruelty. Quote, "No sooner did Ariovistus defeat the forces of the Gauls in battle than he began to lord it haughtily and cruelly, to demand as hostages the children of all the principal nobles, and to wreak on them every kind of cruelty. If everything was not done at his nod or pleasure, then he was a savage, passionate, and reckless man, and his commands could no longer be borne." Back to a savage, passionate, and reckless man, Caesar was currently on the lookout for pretext to beat up on free Gaul, and he...
Jen, what's that smell?
Opportunity.
I mean, it smells just like toxic masculinity to me.
I mean, one and the same in this episode.
Apparently so.
But Caesar wasn't going to start a fight without making it look like he'd followed protocol. He needed his battles to be justified. So Caesar reassured Diviciacus and the other visiting Gauls. He said, don't worry, guys. I'll go talk to this Ariovistus and I'll make him see reason. And if he doesn't see reason, maybe he'll notice my very powerful army just hanging around outside, not looking threatening, but totally threatening.
Yeah, just, hanging out, sharpening their weapons.
And they're eagles, Jenny. We forgot the eagles.
Oh, right. And all the shiny eagles. Caw! Caesar, like this is the second time I've had to say, what am I doing? Caesar was hoping this would come down to a fight, obviously. He probably planned to make it come down to a fight even if it didn't, but he needed the optics to be just right. Like I said, his attacks had to look justified. So Caesar sent a message to this Ariovistus demanding that he pick an intermediate spot for the two to meet and have a friendly conversation over coffee and just sort out this whole subjugating the Aedui and Sequani misunderstanding that has been going on. Ariovistus just completely busted a gut when he got this message. He said basically that since Caesar was the one who wanted this meeting so badly, Caesar could come to him. Like, no, I just am not going there. No, I have everything I need right here. Why can't you come to me? Anyway, Ariovistus has told Caesar that he can just show up himself if he wants this meeting so badly. And then there was some passive-aggressive back and forth on this. Both sides made some threatening noises, and eventually the two wound up scheduling a time to meet in person. And here is where Caesar ran into a spot of difficulty. On his way to the meeting point, Caesar stopped off for a few days to gather provisions. While the men in his army bought supplies from Gallic tribes, they naturally asked, so these German guys were gonna go meet and fight. What's the DL on those guys?
And they did not like what they heard. The Gallic traders described terrifying men of giant stature, incredible skill at fighting, and unbelievable toughness. And remember, the Romans thought the Gauls were incredibly large, warlike, and tough. But the Gauls were saying, nah, dude, these Germans make us look like kittens. Meow. Meow. Where's Heloise?
Heloise says, yeah, these guys look like kittens. I should know because I'm a kitten.
Oh. Meow. All right, Heloise, calm down. I gotta tell a story now.
My one tell in life is making cat noises. Just let me have this, Jen.
No, it is time for a story.
Sorry, Cucullin. I'll shut up now.
It started with the tribunes and the prefects, higher-ranking officers who didn't have a lot of actual military experience and who had their positions because they were friends with Caesar. They started making noises that maybe they should sit this one up because all of a sudden their sinuses were acting up and they were like sneezing and a little congested and can't do this right now, Caesar, sorry.
I mean, the allergies in ancient Gaul.
The hay fever, it was brutal. But Caesar had a fight to pick, and he basically rolled his eyes at these excuses, and this led to the officers bursting into tears in public, hiding in their tents, and key thing here, bewailing their fates to their men.
These officers were not army strong.
No, they were having a full-blown freak out. They were really not okay with this. And they were letting that fear and anxiety spread. So pretty soon, panic had spread throughout the entire army. And suddenly, even the rank and file were dictating their wills and hiding in their tents. Higher ranked officers worked harder to persuade Caesar to give up on this whole thing, saying the roads were narrow, the forest was vast, and how were they going to get the supply chain all the way over there? The officers even declared, somewhat ominously, that considering the mood in the camp, they didn't even know if they could get their soldiers to march when the order came down.
Of course, if the troops refused Caesar's orders, that would be mutiny. A lesser commander might have seriously rethought giving this order at this point because the last thing he needed right now was a troop revolt on his hands.
We saw that, actually, in our last season with Nero,
whose troops refused to assassinate his mom. Maybe a lesser commander might think if his officers were warning him that the troops might not listen to that order, he should rethink that order. Maybe only give orders he was sure his troops would obey. But this was not a lesser commander. This, as I must remind you, was Julius fucking Caesar. Caesar called a council of all his officers, and he started off with a clarification of everyone's roles. He said, look, you're the officers, and I'm the general. That means it's my job to decide what direction we march in and why we're marching in that direction. And it's your job to not question it. Everyone clear on that? Good.
And as for these logistical concerns, the road being too narrow, the forest too vast, and all these other extremely transparent excuses, I'm going to need you guys to actually back off on that line of questioning because it's my job to worry about that, not your job. I'm Julius fucking Caesar, and I'm the general.
Yes, so just in case anyone is confused on who I am and who you are, hopefully this clears it up. And then he went on to, he's giving them some reassurance. He says, this Ariovistus guy, he's not that scary. He was declared a friend of the Roman people a couple years back, and there's no reason this even has to come to a fight. But if it does, why assume we're not up to the challenge? After all, Marius fought these guys a few decades ago and won. The Helvetii even defeated them in battle at one point, and we just beat those guys. So, look, it's gonna be fine either way.
Yeah, and furthermore, as to this possibility of mutiny that you guys keep bringing up, I think you're underestimating the troops. I have faith in their loyalty and courage, but if I do give that order and nobody else follows, I'd just as soon go with the 10th Legion at my back, because those guys are my favorite legion. Matter of fact, I'm making them my Praetorian cohort. And also, you know how I said we were marching in a couple of days? Actually, we're gonna march right now. Go pack your shit.
And this speech shows just exactly how good a leader Caesar was. He set up competition by singling out one legion among many as his most trusted. Suddenly, all the other legions were keen to prove that they were just as good as the 10th. I don't know if he picked the 10th at random, but it worked. He assuaged their fears, but he wasn't a soft touch. He also set hard boundaries about everyone's role and everyone's job and upped the pressure by marching quickly, and also projected a serene confidence the whole time that a mutiny was completely out of the question. You guys are dopes. And furthermore, he did this all without threatening or punishing anyone, which was really good for morale. So you could see why the officers were suddenly scrambling all over each other to carry out his orders.
Adobe Acrobat Studio, your new foundation. Use PDF spaces to generate a presentation. Grab your docs, your permits, your moves. AI levels up your pitch, gets it in a groove. Choose a template with your timeless cool. Come on now, let's flex those tools. Draft, design, deliver, make it sing. AI builds the deck so you can build that thing. Do that, do that, do that with Acrobat.
Learn more at adobe.com/do-that-with-acrobat.
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
So Caesar managed his mischief among the legions, got everyone together, and pointed them in the direction of Ariovistus. The two of them met up, and Ariovistus had an answer for all these spurious Aedui accusations, quote unquote.
He said that first off, he hadn't invaded Gaul under his own steam. He'd been invited, and sure, he'd made war, but he didn't start the conflict. He'd merely warded it off. Furthermore, crossing the Rhine was a big endeavor. He'd never have done it without the expectation of some reward at the end.
Ariovistus does not leave his house with his body unless there's some kind of reward in it for him.
Look, Ariovistus is a lot like me. He does not do his hair, put his makeup on, get himself looking all great, leave that house without the assumption that good things are going to come his way. Otherwise, you know what? He's going to stay inside in his pajama bottoms, watching Netflix or reading a good novel.
That's right. Ariovistus has everything he needs right there in his house. He's not going to leave his house unless there's something in it for him.
He can even do his yoga from YouTube in his house. And yes, we know he can't.
I don't see why he can't, Jen. He can do whatever he wants. He's Ariovistus.
Because it didn't exist then. But if it did, that's what he would do. He'd be an Instagram fame boy. He'd have a man bun.
Oh my God, I'm picturing him with a man bun right now. And a mustache.
Mustache?
Mustache.
Anyway, this is just all to say that his settlements in Gaul had been granted to him by the Gauls themselves. So back off, Caesar. This is not your fight.
And secondly, those hostages the Aedui mentioned, they were willingly provided by the Gauls in accordance with long-standing custom to secure friendly relations. And he may have had a point there. Fosterage was a big part of Celtic culture. Remember in the cattle raid of Cooley, the huge boy troop living at King Concovor's castle? Those were all sons of lesser kings in the area sent to Concovor as a guarantee of their allegiance. Essentially, hostages. So this was a thing that these groups of tribes did a lot to encourage cooperation for lots of different reasons.
Because they were hostages and you weren't going to act up when your son and heir was living with another king. And third, as to those accusations of cruelty, Ariovistus also said that the part of Gaul he ruled over was his province, just as the region to the south was a Roman province. He didn't tell Caesar how to govern his province in Gaul, so Caesar shouldn't tell him how to govern his own. In other words, butt the fuck out, JC.
And one last thing, because Ariovistus is not done. He wasn't some unsophisticated person who had no idea what was going on in the wider world. He said, somewhat ominously, that he was fully aware of the political landscape in Rome, and he had a hunch that if he struck Caesar down right now, there were plenty of powerful people down there who'd reward him for it. They might even throw him a triumph, but he'd let Caesar go from his territory unharmed so long as he went without causing trouble, because that is how magnanimous a guy he was.
I mean, that is a mic drop.
I know, right? Ariovistus has a point.
He really does have a point. And this, as you can imagine, did not result in a ramping down of hostilities. Caesar refused to back down, and suddenly it was war.
Right. The only way that this whole situation would have not played into Caesar's hands was if Ariovistus just capitulated right away and gave him no reason to attack.
Yeah, and Ariovistus was like, here's the thing, bud. If I took your head off right now, they'd throw me a parade. So I think you just need to go back to your side. You do your thing. Leave me alone to rule as I want to rule. I'm not going to bother you, but you stay the hell out of my territory.
Taken that way, he actually sounds pretty reasonable.
He was doing some bad things. Like, I've given you some reason, but he wasn't really.
You can fall into the rabbit hole of whether or not the Aedui were really being subjugated or whether they just wanted to pull Caesar into this dispute that they had with these other groups. And you also have to bear in mind that Caesar is the POV character here, and it's in his interest to make you believe that atrocities were happening so that his invasion looks like kind of like a humanitarian mission. And that's kind of the trouble with using the commentaries as your guide in the Gallic Wars, because before long, you're just questioning everything, you're questioning your whole existence, and it is kind of a mindfuck.
Caesar gives us this detail in the commentaries about how Ariovistus piled up his chariots and wagons in a wall behind his army so they literally couldn't flee from battle. And on top of it, they put their women who, quote, with disheveled hair and in tears, entreated the soldiers as they went forward into battle not to deliver them into slavery to the Romans. This was a big part of Germanic culture. Warriors' whole families rode with them to war, and it was customary for women to weep and bare their breasts and beg their men not to let them be sold into slavery if they started to flag in battle. And we talk more about this in the Ataulf and Galla Placidia episode, although obviously that episode is set much further in the future from this one.
There's some Tacitus stuff about Germanic culture and how that worked, and comparing Germanic martial culture to Roman martial culture. It's pretty interesting. The Germans fought in a tightly packed unit, forming a shield wall to sustain the Roman attack. But according to Caesar, quote, many of our soldiers leaped upon the phalanx and with their hands tore away the shields and wounded the enemy from above. And I just have to stop here and talk about that. It takes a special kind of badass to jump on top of a shield wall and stab down at the masses of seething, roiling bodies, wielding spears and swords below, all of them intent on murdering you. You can just imagine the chaos in that. So I would say that everybody who was not the 10th Legion were really trying hard to prove themselves in this moment.
And probably the 10th Legion as well. I mean, they were like, we must show everyone else that we are the great 10th Legion. We're not afraid to jump the shield wall and stab at people.
I mean, I still kind of think Caesar just picked them out at random and they're like, yes, we are the best.
What a way to motivate.
Anyway, the women's entreaties were in vain. Caesar's forces chased Ariovistus across the Rhine and back into Germany. Assumedly, a lot of those women were taken into slavery. Both of Ariovistus's wives and one of his daughters was killed in the rout. Ariovistus doesn't appear in the record again after he fled across the Rhine. We don't know what happened to him, but Tacitus would tell us his end was probably grim. He mentions that, quote, to throw away one's shield is the supreme disgrace. Many such survivors from the battlefield have ended their shame by hanging themselves. But Ariovistus really sticks with me because, first of all, his story shows that no one was really that isolated in this world. Even the more northern tribes far from Rome had ways of getting information. And two, he said out loud what a lot of Gauls were probably thinking. Caesar was beyond the boundaries of his own province, and what business did he even have being there?
Caesar had just become governor of Transalpine Gaul, and already he was taking a very hands-on, violent approach to managing things in areas distinctly north of his own boundaries. and that made many Gallic tribal leaders twitchy. I mean, it's making me twitchy just reading it. In 57 BC, the Belgae tribes decided to take decisive action to drive Caesar out. Caesar's commentaries, his account of the Gallic War, begin with an iconic line: Gaul is a whole divided into 3 parts. He divides Gaul into the Belgae, the Aquitani, and somewhat confusingly, the Celts. He describes the Belgae in northern Gaul around modern-day Belgium as the bravest, fiercest, and most, quote, barbarian of the 3 groups, farthest to the north and most isolated from the civilizing influence of trade contact with the Mediterranean world. Although we've seen this with Ariovistus, this was probably more stereotype than the truth.
Yeah, because Ariovistus was really plugged in, and no doubt other people were too.
Well, yeah, I feel like everyone in this area would have had like some intel on Caesar.
This group of tribes, the Belgae, was the first to seriously come together to oppose Caesar, and this went somewhat against their nature. The Free Gallic tribes were not a unified front. They were a collection of warrior societies who gained status and territory by raiding one another. Intertribal feuds could go back centuries, but now they were preparing to do something they almost never did: set aside regional differences and unite against Caesar. Sometime in the winter of 57 BC, the tribes of the Belgae began exchanging hostages and making plans. And as soon as he found out about those plans, Caesar started marching north toward Belgae territory. Caesar's spies told him that a host of about 289,000 people was gathering against him, and his first step was to divide them. He called the druid Diviciacus to his tent, and he was a leader and statesman of the age you see Diviciacus being called upon to do worse and worse things as the story goes on. Caesar pointed out how bad this was for both Roman and Aedui security to have a force this big gathering to the north. It was crucial to divide and conquer, and Diviciacus was the only one who could do it.
Caesar ordered him to persuade his chieftains to gather their forces because, remember, Druids weren't fighters themselves. Lead them into the home territories of some of these rebel tribes and lay their countries to waste. Burn their towns, kill their livestock, torch their fields, and terrorize their families. Here you see Caesar dividing and conquering. He's getting a Gallic ally to attack rebel Gauls in a way specially designed to fracture the opposing forces, because those tribes whose towns were under attack would have to rush home and defend them. But Diviciacus couldn't attack every homeland, and a large host of rebel Belgae troops was now on the move.
Their first target was Bibrax, which was a Roman-friendly Gallic town in northern France. And you see the Gallic rebels do this a lot. They attack other Gallic towns that are allied to Rome. The Belgae rebels besieged the town, and Caesar sent a crack team of snipers, basically archers and slingers, to defend the town and shoot down bolts from the walls and take out the enemy. The team of snipers held off the Belgae easily, and the united Belgae tribes were forced to retreat into the countryside, where they burned out the surrounding Roman allied towns and farmsteads. When Caesar caught up to their camp, he found Belgae campfires spread out over an area of 8 miles. This was a gigantic army. They were too numerous to attack directly, so Caesar found some high ground outside the town of Bibrax, dug in, and waited. Caesar's position was very strong. He built elaborate fortifications and engineered it so that the only approach to his fortified camp was through a marsh and up a steep hill. And this is not as good for Caesar as it sounded. Adrian Goldsworthy points out that this is often a problem for armies whose position is too strong. If you want the adversary to attack, you have to let them see an opening. And it can't be too obvious an opening. You have to be clever about it. So the Belgae, despite outnumbering Caesar, decided not to attack him at all, but rather to wait for Caesar to get impatient and calm down and fight them on more advantageous ground for them.
But this plan had its drawbacks too. See, the Belgae didn't have a supply chain. Warriors tended to bring only what they and their wives and attendants could carry. Armies could forage, but the larger the army, the more quickly they exhausted the land. And this army was huge. Remember, we said it's like 8 miles long. So when it came to the waiting game, the Belgae were actually in a worse position than Caesar. So the tribal leaders sat down and had a talk. They decided they'd actually done what they'd come to do. They'd showed their strength to the Romans, intimidated Caesar so much that he'd refuse to come down from his hill and fight them on equal ground. And that's how they spun it to their warriors, because Caesar wasn't the only spin doctor in town. They pledged to come to each other's aid if any of their number came under a Roman attack, and then they packed up in the night and headed home.
But the retreating Belgae did not make it home in time. Caesar, seeing what was happening, immediately force-marched his army out ahead of the dispersing forces and attacked their undefended hometowns. The druid Diviciacus pled clemency for the Belgae, and Caesar agreed not to kill everyone, but he demanded 600 hostages from Belgae leading families. Hostage-taking was part of Gallic culture, as we said, but 600 hostages was seen as egregious, even for them. With their children in Caesar's hands, the Belgae alliance was broken. Only one of its members were still willing to stand against the Romans, the Nervi.
The Nervi lived so far north they weren't even in France. Their homeland was in modern-day Belgium, and even among other warlike Celtic tribes, the Nervi were legendary for their ferocity in battle. They saw the other Belgae packing up and heading home, and said, right, I guess it's down to us. The Nervi did not play it the way other Celtic and Germanic tribes did. They didn't take their women and children to war. They'd seen what happened to the families of defeated tribes who went up against the Romans. Those who lived were sold into slavery. So as they fled ahead of the Romans, the Nervi evacuated their non-combatant family members to an inaccessible hiding place deep within the marshes. Caesar chased the Nervi down, venturing deep into unconquered northern territory, and the whole way, spy messages were flying fast and furious between these two armies. Through his spies, Caesar found out that the Nervi had about 85,000 troops, more than twice his own. Through their own spies, the Nervi learned how the Roman army deployed itself during its march, where its weak points were, and where it was planning to make camp. The Nervi got to pick their ground. They hid in a wooded area in the path of Caesar's army and set up a massive ambush at the ford of the river Sambre.
The Romans, unaware of the army hiding in the trees nearby, arrived at the river and began to make camp. And there were very specific camp-setting protocols for a Roman army on the move in hostile territory. They basically built an entire fortress at the end of each day on very carefully selected ground, complete with ditches, walls, ramparts, roads, and barricades according to set plans. This took time. And in hostile territory, it was crucial to have some troops guarding the area while others were on setup duty, because the army was vulnerable while it was setting up camp. But this time, for some reason, Caesar didn't set guards. So when the Nervi attacked, his army was completely unprepared. This was a tire fire. Caesar was personally running around in a flappy panic, calling soldiers in from digging trenches and building barricades to stand in the battle lines. Roman troops had to throw down their spades and scramble for their weapons, booking it back to their legions. There wasn't even time to take the covers off shields or to attach horsehair plumes to helmets.
I mean, I feel like the horsehair plumes to helmet is like the detail where I'm like, really? I mean, that is totally preening.
I mean, bear in mind that there were not that many ways to tell who was a leader and who was your commander on the field. The clothes people were wearing were a big signifier, so I haven't done a whole deep dive into who had a horsehair plume and who didn't, but...
No, you're right. It's one of the, when we talked about the eagles and Germanicus the Manicus, that was one of the ways that they were able to sort of tell where different legions were and where they needed to go if they got lost or separated. Yeah, you're right. I didn't actually think about that.
Yeah, one thing about a horsehair plume is that it makes you visible, which can be bad because your enemy will target you more because you're an officer, but it's also good because it means that your men will rally to you in the chaos of battle. They know who you are, they know who the enemy is.
Caesar ran from legion to legion, encouraging his troops and joining in wherever the frontline fighting was fiercest. And this was unusual for Roman generals. With one particularly beleaguered legion, Caesar snatched up a shield from a fallen soldier and rallied his soldiers by name, inspiring a legion on the verge of retreat to push forward and keep the Nervi in check. Because the stakes were high for Caesar. He'd bet everything on his campaign in Gaul. He was in debt up to his eyeballs. The public prosecutors were sharpening their knives, and his political enemies were just salivating at the chance to get at him. He bet it all on a big, dramatic win, a Hail Mary pass. If he lost in Gaul, he might as well die here.
The Nervi, meanwhile, fought with all they had. They were the last remnants of the Belgae resistance. If they fell, a third of Gaul would fall with them. They were fighting for their homeland, for their loved ones hidden in the swamps. Picture thousands of Cucullans knee-deep in the fords, standing between the army of Connaught and everything they loved. It was a brutal battle, and by the end of it, the Nervi fought standing on the piled-up corpses of their brothers, fathers, and friends, catching Roman javelins in midair and hurling them back in the enemy's faces. Shows of heroism happened that day that belonged in a 1,000-year epic. Men fought and died who deserved to be named heroes, remembered down through the present day in epic cycles of poetry. But that epic never got written, because the only person who wrote down what happened that day was Julius Caesar. He knew the names of individual legionaries in his own army, but not one of the heroes of the Nervi. Despite a brutal rain of javelins, arrows, and sling stones, not one of the Nervi was seen to flee. They gave everything. It wasn't enough. Despite outnumbering the Romans, despite having the advantage of surprise, despite choosing their ground carefully, and despite their unimaginable courage, the Nervi lost. Out of 85,000 warriors, only about 500 survived this battle.
This was a disaster for the Gauls. With the defeat of the Nervi, Caesar was within a thread of holding control of all Belgae territory. A third of free Gaul was no longer free. There were still some holdouts. A tribe called the Tuatuci holed up in a hill fort, but when they saw the Romans wheeling their siege engines up to the walls, they surrendered quickly, even throwing their weapons over the wall, creating a pile of weapons allegedly as tall as the city walls themselves. Caesar accepted the surrender, and even shut the city gate to stop his own soldiers from entering the town, to prevent plundering and to protect the populace. But some of the Tuatuci warriors hid their weapons in their houses, and when night fell, they ventured out of the town walls to attack the Romans. Caesar's vengeance was swift. His forces killed most of the attackers, and then he sold every single surviving person in that town into slavery. According to the commentaries, Caesar sold over 53,000 men, women, and children for one flat price to a merchant group who'd been following his army. There were slave merchants, by the way, following Caesar's army. This was one of the ways Caesar recouped his investment in this war, by selling slaves.
I feel like if you don't know that much about Julius Caesar and you listen to the 2 episodes we did on his life before the Gallic Wars, you can kind of be forgiven for liking Caesar. Like, he's kind of fun, right? He gets kidnapped by pirates, he stands up to Sulla.
I unabashedly admit that Caesar was not my guy, didn't know a lot about him, and when Jenny was pitching me this series, she was like, oh yeah, he gets kidnapped by pirates and then harasses his kidnappers into extorting more money. And wait, let me tell you the best bit. While he's there, he makes them listen to his terrible poetry. But the thing is, there aren't really any good guys.
This episode is basically where Caesar does a big heel face turn, and it's pretty clear from here on out he's the villain in the story. And this is just one of the extremely reprehensible things that he does in Gaul. He is the unreliable narrator that we are stuck with. From 58 to 55 BC, a period of about 3 years, Caesar rampaged unchecked through northern Gaul, wreaking havoc wherever he went. He defeated Gallic tribes by land and by sea, slaughtering ruling families and selling the survivors into slavery. He ravaged the land, burning forests and crops, and killing livestock so rebels would have nowhere to hide and nothing to subsist on. And while he was at it, he engaged in a campaign of large-scale larceny. The Gauls, as we've talked about before, were not poor. In our previous episodes, we talked about the glittering jewelry, massive plates, chariot fittings, and other stunning artwork in gold and precious jewels that were a hallmark of this culture. The tribes of Free Gaul had enriched themselves massively through centuries of trade with Mediterranean cultures, including the Romans, and now Caesar set about plundering all that wealth. Over hundreds of years, the Gauls had set up altars to their gods in massive oak groves, stacking them high with precious offerings. Local people didn't dare disturb objects that had been dedicated to the gods, but Caesar pillaged any altars he came across, as well as the cities and towns he defeated. It was theft on an epic scale, and Caesar enriched himself massively.
These victories kept Caesar in the public eye while he was in Gaul. When he wasn't slaughtering people, raiding sacred shrines, and taking slaves, Caesar found time to write the commentaries, in which he constantly refers to himself in the third person.
Caesar this and Caesar that, and I'm like, dude, I know who's writing this. You can quit.
He also, Jenny, found time to write a book on Latin grammar. I mean, Jenny, he was a massive grammar nerd like you. And Caesar dedicated this tome on Latin grammar to Cicero, who was also a famous orator and grammar aficionado.
He has strong feelings about grammar.
He did.
I mean, actually, I don't know what Latin grammar is as opposed to like English grammar. It's a lot more declensions. And what even is a declension? What is that?
Now you're testing me. I feel like the declensions have to do with the gender, and you go through whether it's plural or singular because you don't have apostrophes in Latin. The declensions also tell you the tense. So like there are certain declensions that will tell you this is like first person past tense based on the ending.
That is super fascinating, actually. I didn't know that.
Well, now you do. I could be wrong, guys. I've been out of school a long time, but I'm pretty sure that's right.
I have no way to check on that unless I Google it, and I'm not going to do that.
I mean, we could check by actually just looking this up on the interwebs, but we're not going to.
What you're getting is what's off the top of our heads, which is always a little bit untrustworthy.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things where, like, actually as an adult, I kind of want to, like, go back and learn Latin again because I feel like I'd have a better grasp of it than I did as a teenager.
Yeah, you could read the Latin commentaries and listen to Caesar aggrandize himself in the original Latin.
Oh, boy.
By the end of his first year in Gaul, the most powerful tribes of the Belgae, the ones who stood the best chance of standing against Caesar, had been defeated, slaughtered, and sold into slavery, including the heroic Nervi. And that must have sent a strong message to other, less powerful tribes among the Belgae. The only ones left were the smaller tribes. Some of these capitulated quickly, but others tried to stand and fight. But to stand a chance against the Romans, these smaller tribes had to be united in their purpose, and this was not easy. The stakes were so high, people saw what happened to the other tribes, and it was hard to build a consensus to fight. Could you blame Gallic leaders who tried to convince their people to capitulate instead of fighting? True, they'd have to submit to Roman rule, but at least they wouldn't have to watch their loved ones be sold into slavery. I mean, what would you do? What would you do, Jen?
I don't know. I want to believe that I would stand and fight because you know what the stakes are, but there's so many moving parts. If you stand and fight and you lose, then everyone and everything you love will be taken from you. And if you don't stand and fight, Julius Caesar might just railroad over and take it anyway. It was just a terrible paradox to be in.
It's a terrible situation to be in, but I really do sympathize with the tribes who didn't want to fight because they're seeing even tribes a lot stronger than them lose. I could see them making the calculus and deciding, you know what, I can't let my family be sold into slavery, all of them. I can't fight because I know I'm going to lose.
And I mean, they've just seen 85,000 Nervi walk onto a battlefield and 500 come off of that field, not as victors.
LifeLock, how can I help?
The IRS said I filed my return,
but I haven't.
1 in 4 tax-paying Americans has paid the price of identity fraud.
What do I do?
My refund, though.
I'm freaking out.
Don't worry, I can fix this.
LifeLock fixes identity theft guaranteed and gets your money back with up to $3 million in coverage.
I'm so relieved.
No problem. I'll be with you every step of the way.
1 in 4 was a fraud-paying American. Not anymore. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
An all-new season of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Mom Talk has just been blowing up.
Whitney and Jen are on Dancing with the Stars.
Taylor is a bachelorette.
Saying that out loud is crazy. Like, that is huge.
But all of the cool opportunities could pull us apart.
It's causing issues in everyone's marriage.
My whole world is falling apart right now. It's chaos.
Watch the Hulu original series, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
So the lesser tribes were conflicted. They began to form alliances, but these were unsteady and they couldn't decide among themselves whether it was better to fight or surrender. Gallic leaders were murdered by their own, both for urging their followers to fight and to make peace, and new leaders were raised in their place. Meanwhile, Caesar's deadly war machine ground on, crushing free Gaul into powder. It's also important to note that for the first half of his campaign, Caesar was mainly active in northern Gaul. The central and southern regions also turned a blind eye. Why? There were several reasons. First, these southern and central tribes were more Romanized than the northern Belgae tribes, even though they weren't technically under Roman control. They were used to giving safe passage to Roman armies on their way somewhere, and even helping in their conflicts. That was part of the deal of being a Roman ally. As was customary, many of them had assisted Caesar, or at least didn't hinder him for the sake of their trade relationships.
Second, I'm not sure exactly what the alliances looked like between southern and northern Gallic tribes at this point, but just because everyone in this area more or less was Gallic doesn't mean they'd feel compelled to defend each other or see Caesar's aggression against some of them as aggression against some kind of whole. To the Gauls at this point in history, there was no whole. These tribes didn't define themselves the way outsiders define them as more or less a uniform group. They were used to operating independently, sometimes raiding each other, sometimes feuding, sometimes joining up, and basically doing their own thing. They wouldn't necessarily see each other as natural allies that they had to defend.
Third, these southern and central Gallic tribes were not in the future. Many believed Caesar's ambitions in Gaul were more limited than they really were, but that perception was starting to turn. After several years, southern and central tribes were starting to realize that Caesar wasn't just there to beat up on northern Gaul for a few years and then leave. Goldsworthy says, quote, Rome now expected her power to be acknowledged on a permanent basis throughout Gaul. The ally had become the conqueror without ever facing serious resistance from the Celtic peoples. And these tribes were also coming to realize that Roman control meant a complete breakdown of their way of life. And again, to quote Goldsworthy, quote, warfare had long played a central role in Gallic culture and society, and chieftains were first and foremost war leaders, whose power was shown by the number of warriors in their retinue. Tribes were no longer as free to fight each other, and martial glory could now only be won fighting as allies of the Roman army. Powerful chieftains knew that seizing kingship amongst their own people would invite swift retribution if the Roman government governor did not approve. It was also harder to create a network of friends, allies, and clients within the leadership of other tribes. The world had changed, and the tribal leaders now found that they lacked full liberty to govern themselves in the traditional way.
Also, Caesar had made some political blunders that had turned off his allies among the Gauls, including in his increasingly brutal treatment of high-ranking Gallic chieftains. He'd had one prominent Gallic aristocrat, Acco, publicly flogged and beheaded, a humiliating death that shocked even the Roman-friendly tribes to the south and east. The message to the Gallic world was clear. Caesar was in Gaul to stay. His presence meant the complete breakdown of Gallic culture, and he believed he could do anything to anybody.
I mean, that's just the motto of the Julian-Claudian dynasty, isn't it?
It seems that way. I mean, the first time we heard that particular quote was from Caligula, but you see that behavior with Nero, you see it with Caligula. Sometimes you even see it with Agrippina the Younger.
Totally. And I suspect it existed with Augustus, but he was clever about it. And going all the way back to good old great-great-granddad JC, or great-uncle.
Yeah, bearing in mind that Augustus was adopted, so this is not necessarily a tie of blood.
He was adopted, but I don't exactly know how that works, because he would have considered him like a father, but he wasn't a biological father, but I think he was an uncle.
It's like Concover to Cuchulainn, right? His uncle dad.
His uncle dad. Exactly. Uncle dad JC.
In early 52 BC, 6 years after he'd come to Gaul, Caesar had achieved a kind of equilibrium after brutally crushing several major uprisings. He thought he could turn his attention back to Rome. And he needed to, because while Caesar was busy wiping whole communities off the map in Gaul, shit was going down in Rome.
Was it ever?
I know. There were gang wars in the streets over the election for praetor. One of the contenders was killed in a street fight, and his supporters burned down the Senate house in the process of cremating his body. It was a trash fire down there. Caesar's like, dude, I turned my back for 1 minute and look what you guys get up to. People were even seriously suggesting that Pompey, of all people, be appointed dictator, which I bet Caesar just loved.
What? Pompey? No way.
Pompey Shark. Seriously?
Pompey Shark the Great?
Right, sit down, Pompey Shark. I mean, the reason that they wanted Pompey Shark in control was because Pompey Shark controlled his own army, and there was no law enforcement in ancient Rome at this time.
There was no police, there were no firefighters, because remember, Crassus was just going into whole neighborhoods and burning it down and then selling the land out from under people and redoing the houses.
Right, that is exactly what Crassus was doing, and also he was definitely lighting those fires. I gotta just call it like I see it. So anyway, stuff was going down in Rome, and a widespread levy of troops was announced to guard the Roman state against violence because, like we said, no police force.
Caesar took advantage of that chaos, traveling to Italy to raise more troops for his campaigns.
The widespread troop levy permission was so that troops could be raised to guard the capital and keep order. And Caesar just decided to, under the auspices of this, raise more troops for himself. Because it's all about Caesar.
And while Caesar was gone, some of the central and southern Gallic tribes seized the opportunity. According to the commentaries, quote, "The leading men of Gaul, having convened councils among themselves in the woods, complained of the death of Acco."
Remember, Acco was the guy who got flogged and beheaded in this really humiliating way. Caesar had executed this Gallic aristocrat Acco in this really high-handed way, and that turned off a lot of the Gallic chieftains, even the ones he was allied to.
They point out that his fate may fall in turn on themselves. They bewail the unhappy fate of Gaul, and by every sort of promises and rewards, they earnestly solicit some to begin the war, and assert the freedom of Gaul at the hazard of their lives.
A tribe called the Carnutes struck the first blow. They descended on Genabum, which had once been their town, but now held a sizable population of Roman merchants and soldiers and their families. The Carnutes slaughtered the Romans in Genabum and threw their bodies in the Loire River. The gauntlet had been thrown down. The news traveled fast, by shouts, person to person, neighbor to neighbor. By nightfall, the news about the fall of Genabum had traveled over 160 miles to Arverni territory and reached a young man named Vercingetorix. And we're going to tell you what happened next in the next episode.
So that's it for this week. Tune in 2 weeks for the next installment of our series on the Gallic Wars.
In the meantime, you can catch us on social, on Twitter at Ancient Hist Fan, or Instagram and Facebook at Ancient History Fangirl.
We also have a Patreon. We mentioned it at the beginning of the episode, and it's worth mentioning it again. It's a great way to support the podcast, and there's something else in it for you. Shout-outs in an episode, a chance to vote on various things that we've got running on the Patreon, and our movie nights.
And if you like what we do, there are other ways to support the podcast. Visit our Ko-Fi account and kick us a few bucks. That's also massively appreciated. Or leave us a nice review. We're still building our audience and every little bit helps. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
The revolution was on. When you hear the news, you're at table with your lesser chieftains. They're deep in their revelry, beer foaming thick in their cups, meat steaming on the rough plank table. The messenger tells you quietly, Geneboom is fallen. The Carnutes have risen in revolt against Caesar. The news is welcome. For a long time you've carried this fire in your belly, eating you from the inside. You've watched Caesar from far off, the black cloud gathering in the distance, the coming apocalypse. More and more refugees stream down from the north every year. You've heard their stories. Yet all around you, your people were asleep. You spoke up in the councils and they all dismissed you. You persuaded your father to the cause, but when he tried to rally the tribes to him, the other chieftains killed him. Now you're the chieftain of the Arverni, and when you hear this news, you're on your feet immediately, your voice booming out over their heads. How long will we sleep, you demand, while the enemy gathers its power? Will Caesar be inside our walls by the time we wake? It's a fine speech. It gets you kicked out of your city and stripped of your chieftainship. You set your back to your city and go out among the refugees because you are one of them now, stateless and cityless. They tell you stories of Caesar's atrocities. You recognize the fire that burns in their bellies, how like it is to yours. You seek out all those who harbor the sacred fire and you draw them to you. You remind them of what they are. Your people are great and epic, a proud, courageous culture of chariot warriors, champions of feats, veins brimming with the blood of heroes, children of a glorious lineage who dreamed of death in battle. You tell the refugees, don't forget what you are. Turn the fire in your bellies against the Roman hosts, and there is no force on earth that will stop you. They gather around you, raise you up on their shields, and you ride toward your city with your misbegotten army at your back. For decades, your people have made peace with the Romans, allowed them to march their armies through your land, and subjugate your own. Your people have forgotten what they are. You will go and remind them. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl. This episode is a whole divided into 3 parts. In the first part, we talked about the start of the Gallic Wars, everything Caesar did for his first few years in Gaul. It ended when the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix stepped onto the stage. This episode picks the story up from there. You're probably going to want to listen to part 1 of this series before listening to this one.
This episode is also part of a larger arc about Caesar and the Gauls. At the very beginning, we follow Caesar's early career leading up to the Gallic Wars and talk about his reasons for going. Then we take a detour to tell you all about the Gauls in their own words, or as close as we can get, through a mixture of archaeology and Celtic mythology.
With all that said, on with the story. Since 58 BC, Julius Caesar has been on a rampage in northern Gaul. He shattered an alliance of strong northern Gallic tribes, including the heroic Nervi, and knocked down every other tribe who dared to stand against him. Finally, the eastern and southern Gallic tribes, more Romanized and living closer to Roman territory, were starting to turn. A tribe called the Carnutes threw down the gauntlet, attacking a Roman-allied town called Geneboom. The news of that attack traveled like wildfire, passing from neighbor to neighbor in shouts and whispers, until it reached 160 miles south, into the territory of a powerful southern Gallic tribe called the Arverni.
The Arverni were one of the powerful southern free Gallic tribes that were, at that moment, kind of allied with Rome. But they hadn't always been allies. They had tangled with Rome before. In 121 BC, 63 years before Julius Caesar invaded, the Arverni had fought the Romans and lost. This was when Rome had captured that southern strip of land, Transalpine Gaul, that ran along the bottom of what's now France, connecting northern Italy with the Roman provinces in modern-day Spain. When the Romans conquered Transalpine Gaul, they conquered a lot of formerly free Gallic tribes and made their territory Roman provinces. But the Arverni managed to negotiate a treaty and keep their independence. Even so, they suffered a significant decline in power.
The Arverni might not have lost their freedom after they lost to Rome, but it must have left them with significant cultural trauma. Possibly the experience was as traumatic for this tribe as the first sack of Rome had been for the Romans, because they picked up another trait the Romans would understand well, an aversion to kings.
Where have we seen that before?
Yeah, we talked about that in the first Julius Caesar episode we did, Julius Caesar and the Pirates' Ransom, about why the Romans might have had this aversion to kings. There's not a lot we know about that except for what they tell us in their own sort of founding myths, but we talk about it in more depth. Anyway, instead an oligarchy or small group of nobles took control. They were probably ruled over by one single chieftain, but with checks on that chieftain's power. And sometime before 52 BC, we're not sure exactly when, the dates are fuzzy, but it was probably after Caesar's invasion. The Arverni did something a lot of other Gallic tribes have been doing. They killed their own leader, Celtillus, possibly for trying to unite the tribes to fight against the Romans. So remember, a lot of these Gallic tribes had seen Caesar defeat an alliance of the strongest Gallic tribes to the north and take tens of thousands of people into slavery at one time. Caesar was not fucking around, and not everybody wanted to risk a confrontation with him. I mean, you could just imagine the southern Gallic tribes looking at what Caesar was doing and going like, fuck no, I'm not getting involved with that bullshit to the north. Fuck no.
Yeah, and also, like, this isn't Star Trek mentality. Like, not every Gallic tribe wore a red shirt, or a blue shirt, or orange shirt, or I don't know, pick your color pajama shirt.
I think what you're trying to say is it wasn't a cultural hegemony, like where they all wore the same outfit and did the same things and were basically the same people. Like, they were Gallic, and that involved certain cultural signifiers, which we talk about in the archaeology episode, but they didn't consider themselves a united whole.
Exactly. And it was possible that some of the tribes that Caesar was picking on were ancestral enemies of other tribes in the south. I mean, we don't know. And so, yeah, they'd be like, okay, well, you can get rid of our enemy for us. That's totally cool. Get on with it. I mean, it's kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
If you look at the Hound of Ulster, it's Ulster against Connaught. You know, if Caesar showed up in ancient Ireland and was like, yeah, I'll side with the Ulster people against Connaught, they'd probably say yes to that.
Yeah, I just think that it's really important to know that, and it kind of gives you a little bit of understanding as to why they didn't all rise up sooner, or they didn't really realize what Caesar was doing, or that Caesar just considered them all one people and was going to do to one what he did to the other, because they didn't see themselves that way, so they didn't think he would see them that way.
There were basically connections and feuds and friendships and relationships between these tribes that went back centuries. So Caesar was really the newcomer there, and all these tribes did not see each other as the same in a group. You know, they saw themselves as separate, like different tribes who had allegiances to their tribe and not to some kind of whole.
Anyway, in 52 BC, Celtillus was assassinated and his son Vercingetorix became chieftain. Vercingetorix had been about 24 when Caesar first invaded Gaul. By the time he became chieftain of the Arverni, he was probably around 30. And at this point, Caesar had been beating up the tribes in northern Gaul, slaughtering whole cities, selling entire communities into slavery, torching sacred groves, and pillaging shrines and towns for 6 years. But right now, he was looking the other way, turning his attention back to Rome to deal with some chaos down there. And while that was happening, a Gallic tribe called the Carnutes had struck a decisive blow, seizing a Roman allied town called Genabum and slaughtering all the Romans living there. When Vercingetorix heard what happened in Genabum, he was ready. He immediately began rallying his people to join the cause. But his nobles rebelled against him. They had just killed his father for doing the exact same thing, and his own uncle expelled him from his city and his tribe.
But here's the thing. There were now a lot of dispossessed warriors wandering around Gaul, survivors of Caesar's battles who'd seen everyone they loved slaughtered or sold into slavery, and who had no homes to return to. Caesar called them outcasts and vagrants, but I call them refugees, still strong and with plenty of reason to fight. Vercingetorix set about finding these people and rallying them to him. With the strength of an unknown number of dispossessed Gallic warriors at his back, he turned back on the Arverni and drove out his uncle and the other nobles. Then he immediately sent messages to the four corners of Gaul. Those messages said one thing: the revolution was on. Not long after, by unanimous consent, Vercingetorix was declared king of the Gauls. Incidentally, that name, Vercingetorix, probably not the name he was born with. It's one of those name titles like Alaric. It means something like Great Warrior King, and possibly the warrior in that title is specifically tied to the infantry. We have no idea what name he was born with. Maybe it was Kevin.
Kevin just doesn't have the same ring as Vercingetorix. Sorry, all the Kevins out there.
We're being jerks. So anyway, I can't emphasize how big of an achievement this was, how quickly Vercingetorix united the Gauls.
Yeah, and we just got done telling you guys about how the Gauls were all disparate tribes, and they did not did not play nice together and they weren't going to unite behind a single leader. And then Vercingetorix steps up onto the scene and was like, hold my fucking beer, guys.
Right. He's like, hold my fucking beer. We've seen how significant the barriers were that kept the Gauls from uniting behind a common leader. For one thing, the warrior culture, which encouraged intertribal warfare, the divided loyalties that Caesar had been very good at exploiting. And for another thing, the atrocities visited on tribes who fought the Romans and lost. I mean, I just feel like this happened so fast, right, Jen? Like, Vercingetorix just turned around and sent a bunch of messages out, and all of a sudden everyone's declaring him king. The fact that this happened so fast must have meant that Vercingetorix must have had immense personal charisma, possibly enough to rival Caesar.
I mean, Jenny, when you meet characters like this in history, you love to think of them as like heroes in a romance novel. But I don't know that Vercingetorix would work this way.
It's tempting, right? Like, I definitely feel that with him. The thing about Vercingetorix is that there is not much of a save the kitten factor with him, but he was probably the first person among the southern, more Romanized Gallic tribes who saw what was going on with clear eyes. He'd seen Caesar slaughter whole towns, wipe tribes off the map. He knew that if the Romans took control, it meant the death of his culture, the proud, chariot fighting, single combating, hero portioning, oak grove worshipping, head-taking, poet warrior society of free Gaul.
Salmon leap!
The salmon leap! We can laugh about it, but it's true. To Vercingetorix, Caesar was the apocalypse, and to stave off the apocalypse, he was willing to do anything to anybody.
And this is, of course, according to Caesar. We're going to keep reminding you of this over and over again because we are looking at this history of a conquered people from the point of view of the conqueror. When we were talking about this, when we were rehearsing this, because believe it or not, we rehearse these episodes.
You wouldn't believe it to, hear it.
The part that really struck me about this is, would it be worth, the victory that Vercingetorix is trying to achieve? Would it be worth doing anything to anyone if you had to become just as bad as the Romans to beat them?
Who knows how we would answer that question, because it's kind of an extreme situation that we've never been in. It's just like armchair quarterbacking Vercingetorix's decisions after the fact is a little bit unfair.
It's totally unfair, but I do think, as we go on through the story, Vercingetorix has to become just as ruthless as Caesar in a lot of ways in order to keep his people alive.
As we go through, we've asked ourselves as we've gone through this story, what would I do? What would you do? And I wouldn't say it's a fun exercise.
I wouldn't say it's a fun exercise. What it is it's an exercise in empathy. And it's an exercise in really understanding the line that Vercingetorix had to walk down in order to give his people a chance. Not a guaranteed victory, a chance.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
So Vercingetorix immediately started imposing discipline, paying rigorous attention to the formation and equipping of his army, especially the cavalry. And according to Caesar, he punished disobedience severely. Quote, on the commission of a greater crime, he puts the perpetrators to death by fire and every sort of tortures. For a slighter cause, he sends home the offenders with their ears cut off or one of their eyes put out, that they may be an example to the rest. Though again, this is Caesar, get your salt licks out.
What he was trying to do here was impose discipline like the Romans and make an army out of disparate tribes, make sure everyone's loyalty was to him and to a united Gaul. Because if you still thought you were loyal to Geneboom or your old town or your old tribe, whatever, you've got another thing coming. You have to be loyal to him now. Otherwise, this isn't going to work.
Vercingetorix's first move was to attack the cities and hometowns of tribes that were loyal to Caesar. The plan was severalfold. 1, to thin out Caesar's resources, forcing him to rush home and defend his allies. And 2, to terrorize those allies into switching sides. Because if the allied tribes saw that Caesar couldn't protect them, more of them would turn to Vercingetorix out of fear, if not conviction and belief in his cause. Vercingetorix wanted to send a message to the other Gallic tribes that being on the Roman side had consequences. As word traveled, more and more tribes joined him, some willingly, some under threat of violence. A trickle of allies coming into Vercingetorix's camp turned into a fire hose.
When Caesar got wind of the uprising, he was in Cisalpine Gaul. And just so you know about the geography here, we have talked a lot about Cis and Transalpine Gaul. Cisalpine Gaul was a Roman province where Gallic people lived in northern Italy around the Alps, and it's sort of the place where the Italian boot bells out as it connects to the rest of Europe. Transalpine Gaul was a strip of land that ran along the south of France, connecting Cisalpine Gaul with Spain. Anyway, Cisalpine Gaul was practically in Italy. I think actually parts of it were in what we consider Italy today. That's where Caesar was at the moment. And that was a problem. Hundreds of miles separated him from his army in Free Gaul, and it had just become enemy territory. Caesar had two options: order his army to come to him or try to go to his army. Option one was a bad idea because if the army marched, it would most likely encounter Vercingetorix and have to do battle without its commander. Chances were high it would get wiped off the map.
Option 2 was even worse. Crossing hundreds of miles with just a small escort, completely vulnerable, threading a minefield of enemy tribes. Even among the friendly ones, alliances were shifting at lightning speed, and nobody could be trusted. All of the tribes had good reason to take Caesar's head to Vercingetorix on a plate.
Because headhunting, that was a thing.
It was in their culture. Caesar chose option 2, thread the needle and travel to his army in secret at night through enemy territory because he was Julius fucking Caesar.
Julius fucking Caesar. This is totally a thing that bastard would do.
It is. I mean, I feel like every time I'm saying it, I'm not aggrandizing it. I'm being very sarcastic.
Shen is bringing the snark here.
Caesar wasn't completely alone. He had some troops with him, mostly noobs he just raised in Cisalpine Gaul. Vercingetorix was out in the field right now, hundreds of miles away, beating up on Rome-friendly tribes to encourage them to change sides. Because, that's always worked with me.
I mean, it's the carrot and stick, Jen, except mostly stick.
Terrible plan.
I don't think it was a terrible plan. I think it was working.
I think it was totally working, but I think looking at it, it's like, oh yeah, that's exactly how I'm going to change my mind about something I feel.
It's just like, you'll just be like, fine, Vercingetorix, I'll just do what you say. Just please stop beating up on me.
I don't respond to bullies on either side, but sure. But the Arverni territory, Vercingetorix's hometown, was not that far from Cisalpine Gaul, the part of the Alps where Caesar just so happened to be.
Tit for tat, Vercingetorix. You attack Caesar's allies, Caesar will hit you where you live. Between the Arverni and Caesar stood a mountain range made impassable by snow at this time of year. With a mountain at their backs, the Arverni thought they were reasonably safe from Roman attack. They were wrong. Caesar's noobs had a tough break-in period. Caesar marched them through brutal winter passes, clearing snowdrifts 6 feet deep to come at the Arverni from behind. It was a Herculean task. Once there, he sent his cavalry to ride as far into Arverni territory as they could, destroying homes, slaughtering civilians, and burning fields. As Caesar planned, word traveled fast to Vercingetorix about 100 miles north, and Vercingetorix was forced to turn around and rush back to protect his people. Caesar left his troops to keep harrying the Arverni, left his subordinate in charge, and told that guy he had to go raise more troops, but he'd be back in 3 days. But that was a fake out. With Vercingetorix's attention focused on his homeland, Caesar galloped with a small retinue 53 kilometers northwest to Vienne, where he had a garrison. He took his own soldiers completely by surprise. He kept his coming as secret as possible and quickly assembled a new group of cavalry.
Then, marching night and day, Caesar traveled through Adria and other tribal territories, where he had 2 legions camped in winter quarters. These were until very recently friendly tribes, but nothing was certain now, and this was a desperate ride, during which he may have disguised himself as a Gaul. I mean, he would have just a giant fake mustache and everything.
Oh, that's kind of fun.
He's kind of fun, right?
Yeah, Julius Caesar disguised with a fake mustache.
Yes, we know it's mustache. We're just going to call it mustache.
The official ancient history fangirl pronunciation is mustache.
Absolutely. But against all odds, Caesar made it to the garrison safely. And once there, he immediately sent messengers to the rest of his army, ordering them to congregate in one place near modern-day Sens, where Vercingetorix's army had been active. Before word of his movements could reach Vercingetorix, which was tough to do because, there were spies everywhere, it took a few days for Vercingetorix to realize that Caesar's attack on the Arverni homeland was only a distraction. Once he figured it out, he immediately headed back north.
And we cannot emphasize how big the stakes were for both of these people. On the line for Caesar, his political career, his aristocratic name, everything he owned, and maybe even his life and freedom. Theoretically, Caesar could wind up tried for crimes against the state when he got home because his consulship had been very eventful. There were people back there who were calling for this already.
that kind of makes me just feel like, so that means he probably committed crimes against the state.
Well, he did. I mean, I don't think that it's actually even a question. If you listen to Julius Caesar and the Devil's Three-Way, we talk about the violence that was happening during Caesar's consulship and the fact that he had allied with Crassus and Pompey, and he had like Pompey's soldiers basically strong-arming people and flooding the Senate with angry mobs and stuff. There was a lot of violence and there was a lot of messed up stuff going on.
So he might have deserved it, really.
I mean, I'm not going to say that you're wrong, but the thing is, to him, I'm sure it was justified. He probably had lengthy justifications for all the things he did.
I'm sure it's in his memoirs somewhere. The Lost Book.
Oh, you mean the commentaries? Because that's not lost. That we have that.
Oh, do we? Sorry. I clearly didn't do the research for this episode.
You clearly have not listened to me talking about the commentaries on and on and on and on ad nauseum.
And read my script at all. Why would I read my script?
Anyway, so yeah, Caesar's looking south and seeing the crap that's going on in Rome right now. He's seeing people getting exiled. He's seeing, back in the Catiline conspiracy, people being strangled without due process down in the horrible hole. And it's entirely possible that if he didn't have a safe political landing, you know, like a position like consulship that would keep him immune from prosecution and having to pay his debts off, he could see himself arrested. He could see himself tried for crimes he committed during his consulship, maybe exiled, maybe even executed. A lot of bad things could happen, basically, if Caesar got this wrong in Gaul.
We're not saying all this because we want to justify what Caesar did, because clearly that's not the case.
We're not Caesar apologists. Caesar was a dill hole.
Yeah, absolutely. But we want to clarify the motivations of the two players here. A lot of the time when people tell this story, Caesar is described as being driven by his all-consuming ambition. And that's not untrue. But also, it's not just like he could go home to Rome if he lost to this battle. Like, this was his Hail Mary pass. If he did not win here, he was in really big trouble. I mean, the kind of trouble you can't come home from.
But no matter Caesar's reasons, which I'm sure were very convincing to him, Vercingetorix clearly had the right of way here, because for him, the stakes were no less than his world, his culture, his tribe, and the lives and freedom of everyone he knew. There was no question. To Vercingetorix, Caesar was the coming apocalypse.
Vercingetorix's next move was to attack a town of the Boii tribe, a subsidiary of the Aedui that was loyal to Rome, and burn it to the ground. Tit for tat, Caesar. You attack Vercingetorix's family and he'll set your friends on fire. Vercingetorix. Caesar wasn't prepared to face Vercingetorix's army directly. He'd had no time to gather rations or pack animals, and he didn't have the supplies to stay long in the field. But if he didn't respond to this attack, he'd send a message to other Roman allies that he wasn't strong enough to defend them, and they'd be forced to join Vercingetorix's rebellion for their own safety. There was no option of neutrality here. He had to put on a show of strength. So Caesar marched. Along the way, he besieged a town called Vercingetorix, stripping the town to the studs for much-needed supplies. A few days later, he arrived at Genabum, the town the Carnutes had taken, slaughtering the Roman townsfolk and sparking the rebellion. It used to be a Roman town, but now it was a rebel town. Caesar got there late in the night and decided to plan a siege for the next morning. Before dawn, Caesar got word that almost the entire population of Genabum was trying to flee over a single bridge across a river. But in the congestion and panic, few were actually getting across. Caesar sent his legions into the town, burned Genabum to the ground, and took the entire population into slavery.
At this point, it must have sucked to be a regular person in this part of Gaul, just trying to go about your life. Nowhere was safe. No one was safe. If Caesar didn't get you, Vercingetorix would. You could join up with either one of these, but that would not guarantee your safety. Caesar might take your kids hostage, strip your town for supplies, leaving you to starve, and maybe sell you into slavery, depending on his mood. And Vercingetorix wasn't exactly a safe harbor either. You'll see why. One example of the conundrum faced by civilians is what happened in the town of Noviodunum. And this was not allied to Rome, and Caesar attacked it, trying to provoke Vercingetorix into an upfront confrontation. But the people of Noviodunum did not want a fight. They surrendered to Caesar immediately to protect the inhabitants from slaughter.
But then Vercingetorix showed up, and his presence inspired the town to take back their surrender. They started putting up a fight, but when Vercingetorix's cavalry clashed with Caesar's, it was Caesar's troops who won. The people of Noviodunum, who had whiplash by this point, and literally just wanted to live, took back their takebacks, and again surrendered to the Romans. No word on what happened to them after that. It probably depended on how Caesar felt about them. It's possible they were sold into slavery, since they'd taken back their surrender and couldn't wouldn't be trusted, but it's also possible Caesar didn't sell them into slavery because that might discourage other cities from surrendering. Either way, you can see the impossible situations ordinary people were put in as these two huge armies used them as chess pieces. After the siege of Noviodunum, Caesar marshaled his troops and marched toward Avaricum, the most well-defended town in the area. If he took that town, he took the whole region.
Vercingetorix had now faced Caesar's troops in open battle, and it hadn't gone well. Why? Let's delve into that for a second. We're not 100% sure how many men Vercingetorix and Caesar had, but I've seen estimates of as many as 250,000 troops on the Gallic side at certain times and only 80,000 on Caesar's. I don't know if these numbers are, correct, and it depends on when we're talking about during the Gallic Wars, and it involves doing a lot of math, and I'm not a math person, so don't ask me to show my work here. But if it's true that Vercingetorix outnumbered Caesar, why didn't the Gallic troops do better against the Romans? One reason why may have had to do with culture. The La Ten culture, which was what Caesar was encountering in Gaul, was centered around its warrior elite. The high-ranking men spent lots of time training with their weapons. It was crucial to be able to defend your lands against raiders and conduct raids yourself for land and status. However, the Gauls also had to farm and tend their cattle, and they didn't have a professional army devoted 100% to war as the Romans did.
They also weren't as cohesive as the Romans, and we saw this in the last episode. The Gallic tribes were difficult to unite, and once united, even under a strong leader like Vercingetorix, it was like herding cats. Jenny has a cat named Heloise, and good luck trying to herd that one. I mean, we couldn't even get her to do a proper salmon leap, and she likes leaping.
She's really good at the salmon leap, but it was hard to get her to do one executing the proper form. We did get a few decent shots. I'm sure they're up in our Instagram by now.
This is all to say that the Gauls weren't used to working together. Each tribe had centuries of history and feuds between each other. And even among the warriors within a tribe, there was a lot of competition for status. The emphasis was more on individual glory than teamwork. And that meant that in battle, often the Roman side was better coordinated.
And of course, the Gauls are not a monolith. This is just general trends here. Some of it we're getting from Mediterranean writers who were not Gallic. So you do have to take this with a grain of salt.
Yeah, get out your salt lick, guys, whenever you listen to us.
Lick some salt as you listen to everything. Although, counterpoint, look at the Hound of Ulster. That's totally what the culture was like. It was all about individual bravery and specific heroes and salmon leaps and what feats everybody could do individually. And if you read those stories, you do see even different warriors within a specific tribe constantly competing for status. So I'm not convinced that that wasn't a thing either.
No, and I mean, you also see it in Greek mythology. Like, you see it in the Iliad. All of the warriors are striving to be the best of the Greeks, and on one day, well, most of the days it's Achilles, but after he dies, there's all these other people jockeying for that position.
It's not just the Gauls. It's a more ancient way of organizing your warrior culture, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when your hero or your best of the best is so integral to the support of the army and to the morale of the army, I think. So while the Gauls valued individual courage, the Romans valued teamwork. And this is very, very different. Roman legionaries served for about 25 years. And during that time, they were not allowed to marry or have children. The smallest unit was a contubernium, a group of 8 men who slept, ate, fought, trained, and died together. They were rewarded together for each other's courage and punished together for each other's screw-ups. Oh, Jenny, this sounds awful. This is everything I'm afraid of.
What, being punished for my screw-ups?
Or you being punished for my screw-ups.
Right, we just cannot screw up, Jen. It's win or die. No pressure.
No pressure at all. The culture of the Roman army was meant to erase individual bravery and foster collective reliance.
What that meant in battle was that the Roman legionaries fought together like a well-oiled machine. They were organized and highly disciplined. They were more capable of working as a unit while executing complex maneuvers. You see that discipline win out over and over when the Romans take on less cohesive tribal groups. Another reason the Gauls were at a disadvantage had to do with arms and armor. The Gauls at this time wielded large, heavy broadswords with a sharp edge but a more rounded point. These were designed to hack at your opponent with big, heavy downward blows rather than making direct thrusts. The problem with this design is that it works a lot better in a loose formation, with the soldiers in both armies standing kind of far apart. This formation also allows for each Gallic warrior to pull out his flashy warrior feats and stand out on the battlefield. But the Romans were fighting with the gladius, a short, light sword, pointy at the end, built for thrusting and stabbing. This was like, the gladius is very stabby. It's a stabby sword. They did not care about feats. They did not care about standing out. In fact, if you broke ranks and ran out ahead of your legion when you hadn't been ordered to, I think that was a punishable offense.
I mean, they just cared about getting the job done and going home.
Right. to their 8-person tent. The gladius was an ideal close-quarters weapon, and the Romans fought closely packed. They were trained to avoid wild swinging blows at all costs, because the bigger your stroke, the more you leave your defenses open.
I mean, that's very true. You have to be, pretty confident to have a massive stroke, don't you?
I guess so, yeah.
Well, think about it. You're leaving so much of your body exposed.
You gotta keep things close to the vest, otherwise you might get stabbed by the stabby sword.
Some Gauls had chainmail. In fact, the Celts are believed to have invented chainmail. The oldest chainmail armor dates from around 400 BC and was found in a Celtic Latin-style grave in modern-day Romania. But not all Gauls were so richly equipped. Each Gaul, unlike the Romans, had to supply his own arms and armor. The wealthy elites would have high-quality gear, but the less wealthy people most likely wouldn't. There was no standard equipment. In the Roman army, by contrast, everyone got standard issue weapons and armor of the same, usually high quality. I mean, that is the good thing when you have a standing army, isn't it?
Everyone gets their own armor, and it's the same kind of armor all around. The interesting thing here is you can see Vercingetorix trying to counter all this when he first built up his army. One of the first things he does is pay really close attention to how the army was equipped, especially his cavalry. He was probably trying to impose some of the rigorous standards the Romans applied to everyone having the same armor. And when Caesar tells us that Vercingetorix imposed really fierce discipline, even though you do have to remember who's telling us that detail, I actually find it pretty believable because Vercingetorix's discipline had to be harder. His warriors hadn't already been indoctrinated into this ethos of teamwork and obedience. He understood these cultural differences in his people and how they worked against him, and he was trying to impose a framework of discipline over centuries of independence and feuding between tribes, so he had to be strict. He had to put the fear in them. But there was only so much he could do in the time he had.
The Romans had hundreds of years to build this into their army and into their culture. This is the way we succeed. It's the complete opposite of the Gallic culture. So you've got these two very different armies clashing who view the world incredibly differently.
Caesar gets really specific about how Roman weaponry worked against the Gauls. His soldiers carried a pilum, a light javelin designed to bend on impact with the enemy, so the enemy couldn't pick it back up and throw it back in your face. Although this did not stop the Nervi. Long live the Nervi. And you see that working to great effect when Caesar fights the Gauls. When he fights against the Helvetii, way back in the beginning of his invasion of Gaul in 58 BC, he describes his soldiers' pilums getting stuck in the Gauls' big shields. They had these big wooden shields, which hindered the Gauls fighting and forced them to toss away their shields and fight without this protection.
And one more thing, the cavalry. The Gauls had a reputation as some of the best horse people in the world, not including the Scythians, of course. If you want to learn more about them, go listen to our Amazon series.
The Women Warriors of the Ancient Steppe, I think, is where we really deep dive into the Scythians, and that's a really cool episode.
But the thing is, the Gallic horses weren't that big. They were more like ponies. Yay, fat little ponies. That means that they were more suitable as skirmishers, engaged in more sporadic, harassing combat, rather than acting as the core of an army. And that's exactly how you see Vercingetorix using them, because the Romans had big horses, didn't they?
They did. They had bigger horses than that, at least. I don't know exactly what the breed was. That would actually be an interesting deep dive.
Yeah, maybe on our Patreon.
Yeah, maybe we'll do a deep dive into the breeds of Roman horses for the cavalry. So there were several reasons why Vercingetorix was at a disadvantage against the Romans. To defeat Caesar, he had to be smarter, quicker, and harder to catch. And he had to do what in Roman army slang they used to call kicking the enemy in the stomach. Vercingetorix gathered his tribal leaders together and laid out his strategy. Rather than risking an open confrontation, they'd basically pull a cuchulainn. They'd wage a guerrilla war, harassing the Roman supply lines, picking them off in small groups when they ventured out to forage, and never letting them sleep or eat or know a moment's peace. But Vercingetorix also took things a step farther than cuchulainn by not leaving anything for the Romans to plunder.
You mean kicking them in the stomach was just making sure that they didn't have enough food and that they starved?
Yes, that is what it means.
Oh man, I wouldn't like that.
You're not supposed to like it, Jen.
Vercingetorix had seen the Romans get their supplies by pillaging Gallic towns. He told his people that the only way they could win was by burning everything to the ground. Their own villages, towns, houses, and field. And this would starve the Romans, force them to range far afield to forage, making them more vulnerable to attack. He told his people, quote, "If these sacrifices should appear heavy or galling, that they ought to consider it much more distressing that their wives and children should be dragged off to slavery, and themselves slain, the evils which must necessarily befall the conquered."
In other words, to get out of this alive, everything they loved had to burn. And his people unanimously agreed, which again is just astounding. And not only because leading the Gauls was like herding cats or sharks or me and Jen, any kind of being that just does not naturally herd. Assuming they could drive the Romans out at all, what would they live on afterwards? There was a very real risk of starvation if they burned everything in every direction. Again, the fact that everyone agreed to this speaks to the towering charisma Vercingetorix must have possessed. But his chieftains begged for one exception, Avaricum. And remember, Avaricum is right in Caesar's path right now at this moment. Caesar's marching towards it.
Avaricum was the most important city in the Bituriges territory around Bourges in modern-day France. It had a population of about 40,000 people, and it was a mining town. There were important iron mines in the area, and metalworking was one of Gaul's superpowers. So this would have been an important source of metal for Gallic weapons production, and also shiny, shiny jewelry. We talked about it in our archaeology episode, but the Gauls were the first people to make plated jewelry, and I love the idea that they were this very status-conscious society, and they sort of made it so that everyone could have things. It didn't have to be all just the wealthy having it. You could have a little bit of gold plate somewhere. How amazing would that be? You still have to be pretty wealthy, I guess.
But not as wealthy.
Yeah, it wasn't all solid gold. Avaricum was located on a steep hill surrounded by a river and marsh with only one narrow entrance, and it was well fortified. Vercingetorix didn't think it was strong enough to withstand a Roman siege and thought protecting it would be a needless waste of resources.
His initial strategy was just listen, Caesar's already marching there. If we burn it to the ground, he's going to have nothing to take. And then he won't have any supplies, and he'll be stuck deeper in our territory with no supplies. So he wanted to destroy Avaricum.
Yeah, and that was not a bad idea. But the Bituriges threw themselves at Vercingetorix's feet, begging that they not be forced to, quote, set fire with their own hands to the fairest city of Gaul. And against his better judgment, Vercingetorix agreed to help the Bituriges protect their town.
Caesar showed up at the walls of Avaricum and immediately began building siege engines and a giant ramp to wheel those siege engines up to the city walls, which, remember, were high on a steep hill. Vercingetorix camped about 15 miles away, shadowing Caesar closely. He basically had one job here: slow the Romans down, starve them. He knew he couldn't defeat the full Roman army in open battle, but he could stop them from eating. He watched the Romans carefully and cut to pieces any foraging parties that wandered too far. The Romans had to be very careful when venturing outside camp, going at irregular hours and a different way each time. This severely limited the Romans' foraging abilities, which meant Caesar had to wrap this up fast. Under the watchful eye of the Gallic forces, Caesar began to erect siege towers. Meanwhile, he sent messages to his allies, the Aedui, for supplies, but the Aedui were tapped out themselves. Starving at this point, the Roman army subsisted only on a few cattle driven in from the villages nearby.
Caesar could have had a mutiny on his hands, but he was careful to encourage his troops, visiting each legion as it worked. He told them if they couldn't hack it, if they were suffering too much, he'd give up on this siege. But the legions wouldn't hear of it. They told him they'd consider it an absolute disgrace to abandon a siege after it was started, and declared their willingness to put up with any hardship. Everyone was still trying to prove themselves against that legendary 10th Legion, Caesar's favorite legion. Meanwhile, the armies of Vercingetorix were also suffering from hunger because scorched earth tactics bit both ways. Vercingetorix also had to wrap this up fast. He led a group to ambush some Roman foragers, and in response, Caesar moved his army to threaten the entire Gallic camp, forcing Vercingetorix to withdraw. Checkmate.
And now Vercingetorix was the one dealing with a possible mutiny. The other chieftains got spooked. They said it looked mighty suspicious that Caesar showed up to threaten their camp right when Vercingetorix left with half their cavalry. Coincidence? I think not, they said. And in our last episode, we showed you how Caesar dealt with dissension in the ranks, and this is how Vercingetorix dealt with it. He captured some Roman camp followers from a foraging party. And camp followers, I feel like until I started researching this, I kind of thought that a camp follower was probably a sex worker who followed the army and just kind of worked in the army. And actually it was, I think, basically anyone who was a non-combatant following the army, like sex workers, yes, but also people like bakers and blacksmiths and people selling supplies to the army and stuff like that. There were a lot of people following this army who were not actually combatants.
Yeah, because those would be really useful. Those roles are incredibly important.
Yeah. Anyway, so Vercingetorix captured some of these poor camp followers. He had them tortured and starved, and then dressed them up as legionaries and paraded them in front of the chieftains. They'd been coached to tell harrowing stories about the low morale and horrific conditions in the Roman camp, and how Caesar's army was on the verge of giving up. This worked. The chieftains were totally convinced. They clashed sword against shield to applaud him as their king, and Vercingetorix's position position was restored. And I don't know, if you listen to the first Vercingetorix episode and you remember how Caesar dealt with dissension in his ranks when his army was about to go and attack Ariovistus, if you compare those two instances, right? Like Caesar is basically a soft touch compared to Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix doesn't have time for this shit. Vercingetorix just didn't have the luxury of being a soft touch. He had to reestablish dominance fast because they're in the field. He doesn't have time for this crap.
Yeah, there was nowhere he could go. Like, this is his homeland. Everything is burning. He doesn't have time for this crap. And Caesar also has the years and years and years and years of training and discipline drilled into his army that Vercingetorix does not have. And while that works for keeping them, like, all together as a unit, it's also easier to remind them of why they are this unit and to play on those loyalties to get through a mutiny in a way that Vercingetorix doesn't have.
There are all kinds of ways that the deck is really stacked towards Caesar and against Vercingetorix here, and this is just one of them.
Well, he didn't have any time and he didn't have a choice. And also, he had a very steep learning curve. He was training a group of people who were used to fighting individual warriors as part of a warrior culture against this massive collective that moved together, worked together, and supported each other in ways that the Gallic tribes were not trained to do. There was no room for error, and it was a total clash of two different armies and two different cultures.
And two different outlooks and ways of seeing war.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the defenders of Avaricum were engaged in a war of wits against Caesar's siege engineers. The Romans threw up grappling hooks, the Gauls turned them aside with nooses. The Romans built a ramp to bring their siege engines up to the walls. The town's miners dug tunnels to undermine them. Because remember, this was a mining town.
Yeah, tunnels were their thing.
Exactly. I just love that detail. As high as the Romans built their siege towers, the Gauls increased the height of their walls. The defenders also sent warriors by night and day to harry the Romans and set the siege works on fire, because everything needs to be on fire.
I'm sensing a theme here, and the theme is your shit's on fire.
It's all burning. With boiling pitch and heavy stones and sharp stakes, the Gauls prevented the Romans from approaching the walls. Even so, under the menacing eye of Vercingetorix's army and the constant challenge from the defenders, Caesar managed to keep his starving troops focused long enough to raise a ramp 80 feet high and 330 feet wide from the plains to the enemy's walls. And just as it was completed, the Romans realized the ramp was sinking and also it was on fire. Everything is on fire. The miners had dug a tunnel beneath it and then set fire to the tunnel's supports so that the ground itself would collapse. I mean, that is well done.
Boss move.
Mm-hmm.
Both the Romans and the Gauls acted immediately. The defenders cast pitch and torches and dry wood on the ramp, trying desperately to get it to light, while a Gallic attack squad rushed out to beat off the Roman army. The Romans attacked the Gallic defenders and fought to defend the ramp. The Gauls fought with enormous courage. Even Caesar could not play this down. In his commentaries, he recounts the story of a brave Gallic defender standing outside the city gate, throwing balls of pitch at the ramp. He was shot by a dart and fell dead, and immediately a second man stepped into his place. When he was killed by a crossbow bolt, a third stepped into his place, on and on until the Romans finally repulsed the Gauls. Vercingetorix saw the battle was lost, and he ordered all the warriors in the town to flee in the night and join his army. But he only wanted the warriors. He couldn't afford to have women and children along, taking up valuable resources. The warriors from Avaricum would have to leave their families behind. To get out of this alive, all they loved had to burn.
This is why joining Vercingetorix was no guarantee of safety. Vercingetorix was very, very willing to sacrifice everything, and to roll with him, you had to do that too. If you were a warrior, that meant leaving behind your whole family, because scorched earth tactics were hard on both sides, and battles were often lost and won by who had more supplies. But when the women of Avaricum got word of this plan, they ran out into the streets and cast themselves weeping at the feet of their husbands. The resulting noise alerted the Romans, and now all of the Gauls were trapped inside. Caesar took the town quickly, and though he was sometimes relatively merciful to Gallic towns, meaning he sold the inhabitants into slavery rather than slaughtering everyone wholesale because he thought of that as merciful.
Yeah, that was his idea of mercy. I don't know that we agree with that.
We definitely don't agree.
Yeah.
This time, Caesar instructed his men to, quote, reap the harvest of victory proportionate to their exertions.
At first, the Gauls planned to keep up the fight, retreating to a wide marketplace inside the town and forming up a wedge to repel the Romans. But as the Roman soldiers crowded thick on their walls, their spirits broke. Most threw away their weapons and ran. Tens of thousands were cut down trying to leave by the narrow gate, and those who made it through were slaughtered by the cavalry. Caesar tells us that, quote, being excited by the massacre at Genabum and the fatigue of the siege, the Romans spared neither those worn out with years, women, or children.
And we can't underestimate the brutality of what happened in Avaricum. We've talked about what happens inside a town when it's being sacked by an invading army in our first episodes, How to Survive a Siege Part 1 and 2. Roman soldiers were in an environment where human violence was baked in and strongly encouraged. Under strict military discipline, that violence was controlled and channeled in specific directions and towards specific purposes. But inside an enemy town, in narrow streets where they were no longer under the direct supervision of their officers, that control broke down, and it was very common for soldiers to unleash their frustrations on the vulnerable inhabitants of a town.
Remember here that Caesar was not even just looking the other way, he was actively encouraging it, which made it 10 times worse.
Absolutely. What would usually happen was that anyone who put up even the slightest resistance would be killed immediately. Women would be sexually assaulted on a widespread level, and the attacking soldiers would steal everything of value in the town. It was a frenzy of terrible violence and larceny. Sometimes women, children, and other non-combatants would be taken into slavery, but not in this case. At Avaricum, Caesar took no slaves. Of the 40,000 people who lived in the town, only about 800 reached Vercingetorix alive.
It was a devastating loss, and it gave the Romans a much-needed supply of provisions that the Gauls couldn't afford for them to have, because this war was being won and lost by who had more supplies. But now, it was Vercingetorix's turn to project serene confidence to keep his people loyal. He reassured his people that a single loss, even a devastating one, didn't mean they'd lose the war. He said he was working to unite all of Gaul in an alliance that, quote, not even the whole earth could withstand. And hadn't he said all along defending Avaricum was a mistake? This only proved his sound military judgment. People were starting to say that next time, they'd all better listen to him and stick to the plan.
True to his word, Vercingetorix sent messengers to the far corners of Gaul to plead for aid from any who hadn't already joined him, using threat, emotional manipulation, ties of friendship, blackmail, gift baskets, and any other tactic they had. Gift baskets.
The good Cheetos if you want to get Jen to join your war, just FYI.
And Diet Raspberry Snapple. That's it. That's all it takes.
Me, it's more like the summer sausage and the fancy cheese.
Such a foodie.
We both like Prosecco. That's where we intersect.
That is the intersect. Vercingetorix levied more troops from all his allies, quickly replacing the soldiers he'd lost at Avaricum.
Caesar's next target was Gergovia, Vercingetorix's hometown. His own uncle had expelled him from there when he'd first tried to unite the tribes, but now it had come over to Vercingetorix's side, and it was the center of the resistance, a very strong center. Gergovia was built on a plateau about 1.5 miles long by about a third of a mile wide that stood about 1,200 feet above the surrounding plain. There was only one way up the plateau, and a small group could hold the entrance relatively easily. The rest of the war might hinge on who held Gergovia, so both armies rushed south. Gergovia was about 195 kilometers or 121 miles south of Avaricum. Along the way, Caesar's troops encountered a river called the Allier. The water was too high and flooded for an army to ford it. Vercingetorix got there first, crossed over, and burned all the bridges in his wake. Caesar came to the river and found all the bridges gone and the river swollen by rain. His army began to range along its banks, looking for a safe place to cross. And meanwhile, on the other side, Vercingetorix's army played cat and mouse with Caesar's, mirroring his every movement, stalking him by night and day, and torching every bridge the Romans tried to cross. But Caesar had a plan to outwit Vercingetorix and cross right in front of his face without him realizing it. Caesar camped near a town called Vercingetorix, maybe a little more than halfway to Gergovia. In the night, he sent most of his troops marching south, but arranged to make it look like it was in fact the whole force. Meanwhile, he held a group of 2 legions back and hid out in the woods. This is a fake out. He's doing another fake out. Vercingetorix immediately took off after Caesar's troops marching south. Meanwhile, Caesar's 2 legions worked fast, building their own bridge, and this is where the engineering skills of the Roman army came in handy. He then sent for the other half of his army, which booked it back to the bridge before Vercingetorix could catch up. Vercingetorix realized he'd been fooled. Not in time to stop Caesar from crossing, but with enough time to get to Gergovia before Caesar did. He gave up the cat and mouse game and force-marched his people to Gergovia because everything would now depend on who got there first.
When Vercingetorix arrived in the area, he positioned his chieftains on all the hills surrounding the plateau the town was built on. While waiting for Caesar, he maintained strict, fierce discipline. He kept his cavalry and archers drilling, continually testing their mettle, and held war councils every day at dawn. Because when you have a Caesar problem, you get up early. There's no lie-in. You have to be up with dawn and ready to roll.
Crack of dawn, babe. Get your coffee. No time to waste.
When Apollo drives that chariot across the sky with the sun, you gotta be there. When Caesar arrived, he immediately took a peripheral hill, drove off the Gallic garrison there, and fortified it in the night. Then he considered his options. The Gallic hosts were arrayed formidably against him, each tribe occupying a hill, and a frontal assault would be suicide. He might be able to starve the defenders out, but not until his own supply chain was secured, so his own troops didn't starve as well. I mean, it's all about the starving or the fire this time.
The sub-theme here is starvation. That supply chain, by the way, was currently way behind. Supply chains were often an army's slowest moving component, and because Caesar had to rush to Gergovia, his supply chain was now miles behind him. Caesar had set the majority of his Aedui allies to guarding it, keeping a small contingent of Aedui cavalry with him. But unbeknownst to Caesar, Vercingetorix had a plan. He'd been in touch with the Aedui chieftains. He'd been sending them gift baskets, bribes, I don't know, whatever it took to try and get the Aedui to join his side, and it was working. The Aedui chieftains had about 10,000 warriors guarding Caesar's supply chain, and they'd been fighting for Caesar for a long time now, and the chieftains knew they couldn't just order their warriors to suddenly turn on Caesar. The Aedui chieftains had to give them a good reason.
Yeah, because up until now, Caesar had been winning. Why would you join the losing side?
Yeah, especially if, you're a Gallic tribe, but you don't necessarily believe that these other Gallic tribes are your people. They're just other Gallic tribes.
And maybe you're enemies. We don't know. Maybe they had a beef with some of these tribes and they're like, why would we join with our enemy? This is our friend. We're helping him do the work that we'd want to do anyway.
Right, he's serving our purposes.
Which is slightly awful, but
This is not an endorsement of this activity, but we're just saying there were reasons why the Aedui didn't just completely ditch Caesar a really long time ago. And a lot of this is conjecture because we don't know that much about it.
Yeah, because we didn't write the history, and the only person who did was Caesar.
So remember, Caesar had assigned most of the Aedui to guard his supply chain, but he'd kept a small group of the Aedui cavalry with him as he'd raced on to Gergovia, the elite Aedui warriors. About 30 miles from Gergovia, Vercingetorix had the Aedui chieftains gather the rest of their warriors together and give them dire news. Caesar had slaughtered the entire Aedui cavalry that he'd kept with him as punishment for a perceived betrayal. We can imagine that the message was something like this. Caesar has dishonored you. He's dishonored the best of your best, your elite cavalry. He's gutted Aedui culture and power and sent the rest of you to guarding supplies. You're nothing but a bunch of peons to him, and your best people are expendable.
Were expendable. They were gone.
Right, were past tense. Vercingetorix was exploiting the Aedui's cultural pride here. He even had the Aedui chieftains produce captives who claimed to have witnessed this slaughter of the Aedui cavalry, just like Vercingetorix had done at Avaricum to prevent a mutiny. And just like before, it worked. The Aedui warriors were enraged. They attacked the supply chain they were supposed to be guarding, stealing all Caesar's food and supplies.
Caesar now had a problem on his hands, because without the supply chain, he didn't have anything. He immediately marshaled 2/3 of his army to go and deal with this insurrection, and Caesar sent his Aedui cavalry on ahead to show the rest of the Aedui that they were in fact alive and well.
The Aedui cavalry had not been killed.
No, they were fine. They were like, dudes, what is this all about? We're alive. It's all good.
Yeah.
Most of the guilty Aedui warriors immediately surrendered to Caesar, while the chieftains fled to Vercingetorix's army. But the damage had been done. Vercingetorix had outwitted Caesar into leading a huge chunk of his army out of the theater of battle, and while Caesar was gone, Vercingetorix attacked. Caesar had to book it back, operating on less than 3 hours of sleep, because when you have a Vercingetorix problem, you don't get much sleep, just like when you have a newborn.
A newborn that sets everything on fire.
Mother of dragons.
Vercingetorix is like a baby dragon. Let us count the ways.
Vercingetorix, little baby Viserion. It's fine.
So Jen and I are operating on 3 hours of sleep or less because we have a Caesar and Vercingetorix problem with these episodes.
Everything is burning.
Setting things on fire, not letting us get any sleep.
So Caesar managed to hang on to his position by the skin of his teeth and probably some flames because baby dragon. But while he was fighting that battle, the Aedui rebelled again. Caesar was now in a bind. His supply chain was torched because dragons. He managed to get the new Aedui rebellion under control, but they were clearly going to rebel now every time they smelled a weakness. The alliance Caesar had depended on up until now was crumbling.
But giving up on Gergovia meant a massive loss of face. Caesar couldn't withdraw. And this was not just about pride. It was about projecting an image of strength to Roman allied tribes. If Caesar withdrew, he sent a message that he didn't have the strength to defend them against Vercingetorix's reprisals. Without that certainty, tribes would defect to Vercingetorix out of simple self-preservation. But Caesar Caesar saw an opportunity. He saw that a hill in a strategic location, which used to be crowded with Gallic defenders, was now almost empty. Caesar could use that hill. It was close to the plateau, and some deserters told him that there was a path in the back of it that led all the way up to the town. The deserters also told Caesar that Vercingetorix had been very, very nervous about him taking one of the other hills, one that was key to foraging and supplies, and he'd summoned warriors from this first hill to fortify the second.
What's that I smell?
Toxic masculinity?
I mean, a little bit, but also, it's a trap.
Do you smell a trap?
I mean, sometimes it's like a fugue of pheromones and you can just miss the trap.
I mean, I guess when you're wafting toxic masculinity, you don't smell the trap, and that's why Caesar missed it.
To get the hill he wanted, Caesar resorted to trickery. Caesar dressed up some of the mule drivers from the baggage train as cavalry, set some of the real cavalry in with them, and sent the whole group out to go and keep up a very loud, very conspicuous eye on what was going on the second hill. He was making it look like he was sending all of his cavalry to the second hill. But he wasn't, guys.
Right, that's why he was dressing up these mule drivers. He wanted to make it look like all his resources were concentrated on that hill when they actually weren't.
Meanwhile, he took another legion, had it hide its standards and cover its military insignia, and sent it off toward the first hill, the one with the path up to the town. He sent his men in a trickle, ordering them to wander over there without much sense of purpose, rather than marching in an orderly line. They were kind of just meandering.
Right. Like, definitely don't look like you're trying to get to that hill. Look like you're kind of lost. You're picking raspberries. You know, you're having a picnic.
Ooh, wild raspberries. Yes, please.
Skipping along with your friends, having a nice day. And, oh, look at that. Coincidentally, we wound up on the hill.
There was still a small contingent of Gauls on that hill. Still, Caesar's men managed to get to the top of it so quickly that one of the tribal kings, surprised in his tent, had to gallop away with his pants half on. No comment on what he was doing in that tent.
I mean, whatever it was, it didn't involve pants.
It did not.
Caesar wanted his soldiers to take the hill, but definitely not to keep going toward the town. They were not ready for a frontal assault. He ordered the signal for retreat, or for them to just stay still for a second. But because he was a ways behind, the soldiers didn't hear, and all in a froth over the prospect of an easy victory, they surged up the path, right up to the wall of the town. The town was in a panic. According to Caesar, quote, "A shout arose in every quarter of the city, and those who were at a distance being alarmed by the sudden tumult fled hastily from the town. These people in this town had all heard what had happened at Avaricum, and they did not want to be next. Here's what happened." Quote, "Married women," and just this quote, you know what? We're going to unpack it in a second, but I'm going to read it to you first. Quote, "Married women hurled down clothing and silver from the wall and, baring their breasts, stretched out their hands to beg the Romans to spare them and not massacre women and children as they had done at Avaricum. Some of the women even lowered themselves by hand from the walls and gave themselves to the soldiers." What is happening here? I feel like there's just so much bared bosom when we read about women in vulnerable situations. Like, I don't understand that.
I don't 100% understand it either. I think there's something with the idea of tearing your clothes, rending your clothes to show how vulnerable and overwrought and upset you are about situations that you see a lot of times in like the mythology and in like the classical like history. I don't know how much was actually real or not real, or the only thing I can get from it is like you're like exposing yourself to be like, I'm so vulnerable, I'm so overcome, I'm so weak and defenseless, please don't kill me. But that doesn't feel right. I wouldn't want to take my clothes off. Wouldn't want to remind them of what they can take if they get in here. Oh no.
I mean, that's my feeling, is that it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull, right? If I'm in a sacking situation and the army is coming in and they all want to like sexually assault some people, the last thing I'm going to do is bare my bosom at them. Like, this does not make any sense. Like, it just doesn't seem like the first thing you would do intuitively. And maybe this is a cultural thing and I'm just not understanding that. But sometimes when I read these passages, I'm like, is this some weird wish fulfillment on the part of the writers that he's like writing this like titillating, literally thing that will get the reader all excited about boobs? Like, I'm not really sure if that's what's going on or if this is a thing that really happened.
Maybe it was a universal sign of being like, we are defenseless. We can't defend ourselves.
Look at our breasts.
It's possible this is in there because this was something that you did to show submission and surrender, like the tearing and rending of your clothes to like show that you're vulnerable and you're no threat.
But also they're giving themselves to the soldiers. Like, I don't understand that either.
I don't know, but we do know that every single time that Caesar has come through a town, if you don't surrender immediately, it goes much worse for you. Like, whatever's going to happen if he gets into this town is going to be shitty. There's two ways it can be shitty. It can be shitty and everyone can be dead. It can be shitty and maybe you live through it. It's up to you which path you take.
Choose from the array of shitty options in front of you. We're really speaking from a remove of centuries and also a modern lens that it makes it hard to understand what our own behavior would be in really extreme situations like this. So we're kind of not in a place to comment.
No, we're not. And I think the confusion that we both have is a very modern confusion about this, like, bearing of your bosom, which seems to be really, really rife in a lot of classical history and mythology, which we don't get.
It's one of those things, I mean, you saw it in The Hound of Ulster in sort of a lighthearted way when all the women were bearing their bosom at Cuchulainn to get him to stop warp spasming. Maybe that was what was going on. Like, these soldiers were all in a warp spasm.
And maybe they were just like, boobs! What is this? Boobs!
Right, it's just a way to distract them from further destruction or a way to self-sacrifice to maybe save other people in the town, like your kids, for example.
Maybe it was a way of throwing yourself at the enemy so that your children and others were able to escape.
Yeah.
So back to the story. A way overeager guy named Lucius Fabius, who'd been heard bragging just that day about not allowing anyone else over the wall ahead of him, got 3 men from his company to raise him up over the wall. He then turned around and started pulling soldiers up behind him. I mean, again, this is what happens when Caesar brags about how great the 10th is. Everyone is constantly trying to live up to it.
Right.
But here's the thing. They'd acted too soon. As enthusiastic as they were, the troops were unevenly deployed, not acting in concert, and exhausted from the events of the past few days. Then, when the Aedui showed up, they freaked out even more, thinking this was a new group of enemy Gauls about to bring the hurt.
And I mean, they could be forgiven because 5 minutes ago, the Aedui were not on their side.
They were not. And now here they show up with their glorious mustaches, and it's like, oh God, they're on that side and on this side. What do we do?
Right, the Gauls within and the Gauls without.
Exactly. The Aedui were, at this moment, Roman allies, and they were clearly showing the sign of being Gallic warriors allied to Rome, which was wearing asymmetric tunics with the right shoulder bare and maybe some scrunchies and leggings, because sometimes we just like to think about how awesome that would be.
Because the 80s, for some reason.
The 80s were fabulous.
They were happening right now, for some reason.
Right now, in the BCs.
Fashion trends repeat, Jen.
I mean, we did see the leggings with the Scythian warrior women, so it's possible.
Yeah.
But did the Romans notice that the Aedui were all 80s fabulous in the prearranged signal? No, because they were panicking like I would be. And when you panic, you miss stuff, which could also be called the story of my life.
Suddenly, this had stopped being fun for the Romans. There was fierce hand-to-hand fighting on and around the walls. That guy and his friends who had been way overeager got their throats slit and their lifeless bodies tossed over the wall. Another centurion was hacked to death by an angry crowd of Gauls in front of the gates in full view of his men, screaming at them to save themselves as he died. It was a blistering defeat for the Romans. Caesar was forced to retreat, and in the wake of this, the Aedui deserted him for good. They went home, burning down the town of Noviodunum in the process. Remember, Noviodunum was the town that surrendered to Rome, then to Vercingetorix, and then to Rome again, because this was just not their week. Then the Aedui made plans to join Vercingetorix. And I guess join Vercingetorix is the wrong way to put it here. When they quit Caesar, the Aedui imagined themselves as the new leaders of the resistance. They went home to their capital, Bibracte, and then summoned Vercingetorix and his army to them and demanded he tell them his war plan so they could approve it. They then went even further, ordering Vercingetorix to turn over command of his army to them. Vercingetorix sat back and was like, cool, why don't we put it to a vote?
Then, all the other chieftains in Gaul unanimously voted for Vercingetorix because he was Vercingetorix.
Yeah, because obviously that's what's going to happen, you guys.
The Aedui, quote, highly indignant at being deprived of the chief command, lament the change of fortune and miss Caesar's indulgence toward them. And I don't even know what to say to these guys.
I mean, I roll.
But also think about who's telling the story. Caesar's like, of course they miss the light and shining goodness of Caesar now, don't they? Traitors.
It's just a last dig at the Aedui from Caesar's perspective.
Yes! But like everyone else, the Aedui saw which side of the bread the butter was on, and they fell in line behind Vercingetorix and kissed Caesar goodbye.
With all of Gaul united behind him, Vercingetorix marshaled his strength and went out to meet his enemy, and he would need the strength of every warrior in Gaul behind him, because he was about to face the fight of his life at a town called Alesia, and we will tell you all about that in our next episode.
So that's it for this week. Tune in 2 weeks for the final installment of our series on the Gallic Wars, Vercingetorix, All You Love Must Burn, Part 3, The Reckoning.
It's not The Reckoning. In the meantime, we'll be on social, on Twitter at Ancient Hist Fan, or on Instagram and Facebook at Ancient History Fangirl.
And we also have a Patreon. This came up at the beginning of the episode, and it's worth mentioning again, because it's a great way to support the podcast. And there's something in it for you. Shout outs in an episode, a chance to vote on various things, and movie nights. And your help is vastly appreciated, and it helps us keep the podcast going. And we have 3 patrons to shout out today. They are Jen Paradiso, Graz, and Veronica C.R. Washington Ramos.
And we apologize if we have mispronounced any of your names.
We do. I'm usually guilty of that, and I'm incredibly sorry. And thank you so much for all your support. It absolutely means the world to us, and it keeps this podcast going.
Yeah, and there are other ways to support the podcast as well. You can visit our Ko-Fi account and kick us a few bucks or leave us a nice review in whatever app you listen to us on. We're still building our audience and every little bit helps. We vastly appreciate all of it.
And we can't stress enough, all of your reviews really help us in the algorithms and they help other people find us. And if you don't want to leave a review, then tell a friend, tell 3 friends. We don't mind.
Yeah, word of mouth is also really important.
Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. The German cavalry strikes again.
It's the 30th day of the siege. 30 days since you gathered your cavalry, opened the city gates in the middle of the night, and bade them run. You told them to raise up the armies of free Gaul, any who can hold a sword. You told them to use persuasion and force and trickery, call the spirits of the ancestors up from the ground, do whatever it takes. Do not fail me, you told them. All of this depends on you now. It's been 30 days since you've sent them, and they haven't returned with reinforcements. You pace the walls, looking out over the enemy siege works and toward the glowing horizon, and you wonder if you'll die here. Far below, you hear Caesar's builders furiously working, toppling trees and raising earthworks, digging trenches and flooding them with water. When the last great armies of free Gaul rise, if they rise, the Romans will be ready. They're walling themselves in, rings within and rings without. A rampart before them to imprison your people, and a rampart behind them to keep out reinforcements. Beyond that, a mazework of ditches and breastworks and walls of bristling spikes. The sound of their work fills the city, morning, noon, and night. And the building isn't the only sound you hear. Far below, between the city wall and the innermost Roman battlement, you can see the women and children, the old and the sick, all those who could not hold a sword, all those who had lived in the city before your army came. They've already begun to die. No part of you wanted this. You held out, fed the civilians of this city as long as you could, until the food supply dwindled and your warriors began to starve. Soon the chieftains were watching the civilians like starving men watching a side of beef. It took surprisingly little time for one of them to bring up cannibalism. Let the ones who could not fight die to feed the ones who could. You thought you were giving the civilians the best of chances. You cannot keep them here. You aren't even sure how long you can protect them from your own hungry chieftains. If the Romans do not take them, you thought, surely Caesar will let them pass. But Caesar would not take slaves, and he would not let them pass. Now they're dying in the no-man's land between walls, women and children and non-combatants, dying by the thousands, of hunger and exposure, all in the sight of your warriors. For some, these were their families. Not even you could have predicted the depths of Caesar's cruelty, or your own. This wasn't the worst thing you've done for the sake of your people, and you may do worse before this ends. It surprises you sometimes how clearly you see the trade-offs, how quickly you make the decisions. You tell yourself you have no choice, not if you want to save them. You pace the walls. At your back, the storerooms are empty. Your people are starving. Inside the city, sanity hangs by a thread. You pray to the gods that free Gaul will rise one more time, that there is anyone left to rise. You pace the walls. You watch the horizon. You wait. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy, and this is Ancient History Fangirl. This episode is a whole divided into 3 parts. In the first part, we sent Julius Caesar hurtling with all the destructive power of a meteor into the ancient, proud warrior culture of Free Gaul. We talked about his reasons for going. We met some of the brave tribes and leaders who initially stood against him and fell.
And in the second episode, we met the last great hope of the Gauls, a leader named Vercingetorix. You should probably listen to those 2 episodes before this one if you want to know what's going on.
Before this, we also set the stage with 2 episodes on the life of Caesar leading up to the Gallic Wars, and 2 episodes on Gallic archaeology and Celtic myth, so that before you get the story of the Gallic Wars, you know exactly who all the players are, and you've heard some of their stories.
So, now that we've got that out of the way, we're going to move on. It's September of 52 BC. Vercingetorix has been in the field for less than a year, and already he's made great progress, mainly by kicking the Roman army where it really hurt, the stomach.
Ouch.
Right. Rather than risking an open confrontation, Vercingetorix has been waging a guerrilla war, harassing the Roman supply lines, picking them off in small groups when they venture out to forage, and most importantly, burning their own cities, fields, homes, and grain supplies so that there would be nothing to forage. To get out of this alive, Vercingetorix was willing to sacrifice everything. And it was working. After Caesar's loss at Gergovia, which we talked about in our previous episode, the Roman army was suffering, and Vercingetorix upped the pressure. While Caesar's army was on the move, Vercingetorix attacked the supply train, which was always an extremely vulnerable point for a traveling army in hostile territory. By attacking the supply chain, Vercingetorix was forcing a terrible choice on Caesar: abandon the baggage and run, or up the guard around the supply wagons and slow his whole army to a crawl. Vercingetorix's warriors took a sacred vow that no man among them would go under a roof or visit their children, wives, or parents until they had ridden twice through the enemy's army.
It's a tall order, guys.
It's kind of like a thing about this warrior culture. Like, they would have been prone to making these grandiose oaths because that was part of who they were.
Yeah, and they were going to stick to it, too. It wasn't just an empty, hollow promise. They weren't going anywhere until they'd done what they set out to do.
No, these people were epic people who lived epic lives.
Absolutely. But Vercingetorix made a misstep. He'd gotten a little too aggressive in attacking Caesar's supply chain. In doing that, he risked an all-out confrontation. Caesar threw his own elite German cavalry into the mix. They forced the Gallic cavalry to retreat and sent them crashing back into their own infantry. Remember, the infantry were the foot soldiers, so hundreds of cavalry soldiers on the Gallic side smashed into their own infantry in full retreat, and that meant a lot of people got trampled and probably killed. It would have been total chaos. This was a huge morale blow to the Gallic army because they placed great faith in their cavalry. And this also goes back to the warrior culture and everything we've talked about in the earlier episodes. Their cavalry was their pride and joy. It was their best of the best.
They're elite warriors and champions.
Exactly. And their elite warriors and champions have now been thrown back at their infantry, their foot soldiers. And in this panic that they're in, they're trampling their foot soldiers. Like, if their cavalry can't take on the German cavalry, this means that, like, the best of their best are kind of saying they're not good enough. That's terrifying.
Yeah, and that's the reason that Vercingetorix has been going out of his way to avoid all-out confrontation so much, because he knows that this is what's going to happen. He knows that his army's outmatched.
So, in the confusion, Vercingetorix was forced to retreat to the town of Alesia. Alesia was a fortified town on a high hill with 2 rivers running by on different sides. Its defensive position was very strong, and Caesar knew a direct frontal assault would be suicidal. But there were approximately 80,000 fighting men in the city now, as well as civilians, the people who already lived in Alesia. The Gauls had strength in numbers, but that was also a weakness, because the larger the army, the less time it would take to starve. And as we talked about in the earlier episodes, this was a scorched earth policy war. So the tighter and tighter these armies get to facing each other, the less and less supplies there are, and the less and less supplies they can get.
The problem is that the scorched earth tactics hurt everyone, and a lot of the time in these battles what you see is that the winning and losing side comes down to who's got more food, who's got more staying power.
Caesar had his legions put their swords down and pick up their spades. He built epic siege works, a wall 11 miles around with 23 small forts spread around the wall and several large camps. His plan wasn't to take the town, so much as to blockade the enemy inside and let them starve. Vercingetorix, seeing what was happening, sent his cavalry down to harass the builders, but the effort resulted in a panicked rout when Caesar sent his elite German cavalry to counter them. And again, remember, they just fought saw the German cavalry and they were like, no, these guys are really serious. Like, we can't do this again.
No, the elite German cavalry, oh no.
So over 10,000 Gallic troops were driven back, and many had to abandon their horses to scramble through a mazework of defensive ditches and flee up the hill to safety. But Vercingetorix had ordered the gates shut. Thousands of panicked Gauls were slaughtered. I mean, that is hardcore. It really is do or die.
Vercingetorix was in a bad position. He saw Caesar digging in for a very protracted siege, and he knew he didn't have enough food to keep his people alive for long. So he gathered his cavalry together and said, look, the situation here is grim. We have food for maybe 30 days, maybe less. So here's what I need from all of you. Go back to your homes. Recruit more warriors, everyone old enough to hold a weapon. If you fail, I'll die here. My death will be on your conscience, and so will the deaths of 80,000 chosen men. Do not fail us. The fate of free Gaul rests on your shoulders. Then he opened the gate in the middle of the night and told them, run. And I can just imagine Vercingetorix standing on the ramparts, watching as practically his entire cavalry, all of his best of the best, broke through the gaps in the uncompleted siege works, not knowing if they would ever return. It also left him without the ability to harass Caesar's troops while they built their own defenses. He had to let them build unimpeded now. It was a hideous gamble, but he didn't have a choice. Vercingetorix's next step was to seize control of the food supply. He counted it out, distributed survival rations, set guards, and let it be known that any who tried to take more than their own would be punished by death. Then he pulled in his people, locked down the town, and prepared for a protracted siege.
Caesar, meanwhile, kept on working. He knew that now, with reinforcements coming, he'd have to wage war on both sides. He had to do something drastic. There was already a wall 11 miles in circumference blockading the Gauls in the town. Caesar built another wall 14 miles around at his army's back, plus ditches, moats, earthworks, and traps. His troops were now enclosed by walls on both sides, one to keep the Gauls in, the other to keep the Gauls out, which is kind of confusing, but if you think about it this way, there's inside Gauls in the town and outside Gauls who are going to come and get them from outside the walls.
Right, inside Gauls and outside Gauls.
Exactly. If Vercingetorix's cavalry came back with reinforcements at all, they would have to navigate a series of lethal booby traps and a maze of ditches to get to the Romans. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix paced the walls, watching the horizon while his food supply dwindled quickly. Finally, the day came when Vercingetorix expected reinforcements to arrive. And then it passed. And things in the city were starting to get tense. I mean, they were incredibly tense. All the food was gone. It had been more than 30 days, and nobody knew if reinforcements were coming or when, and people were starving and desperate.
Vercingetorix called a council of his chieftains. Some of them called to surrender to the Romans. Others wanted to ride out and bring the battle to them in an all-out assault. One chieftain, Critognatus, proposed a third way. This is what he said, quote, I shall pay no attention to the opinion of those who call a most disgraceful surrender, nor do I think that they ought to be considered as citizens or summoned to the council. He didn't think people who wanted to surrender to the Romans even deserved to be there.
I know, he's like, well, they have no voice. Out you go.
Right, sit down, you guys. My business is with those who approve of a sally, in whose advice the memory of our ancient prowess seems to dwell. Let us, in adopting our design, look back on all Gaul, which we have stirred up to our aid. What courage do you think would our relatives and friends have if 80,000 men were butchered in one spot, supposing that they should be forced to come to an action almost over our corpses? Do you doubt their fidelity and firmness because they have not come at the appointed day?
They're getting there as quickly as they can. Some of these tribes had to range really far afield to get back to where they came from and to then convince their people.
Or to find enough people to actually make a difference. You know, I'm sure that close by there are not a lot of people who already aren't part of one of these armies.
Exactly. And also, Vercingetorix is losing. There had to be a lot of spin to get people to come and rescue his ass.
Exactly. He went on to say, do you suppose that the Romans are employed every day in the outer fortifications for mere amusement? If you cannot be assured by their dispatches, since every avenue is blocked up, take the Romans as evidence that their approach is drawing near, since they, intimidated by an alarm at this, labor night and day at their works. So he's saying, look, I'm not even going to talk to you if you think we should surrender. If you think we should fight, we're going to get clobbered. And how do you think our friends and family are going to feel who rallied to our cause to come and rescue us if they show up to find stacks of 80,000 bodies that they now have to fight the Romans over? We have to hold out for them, is what he's saying. And if you think that our allies aren't coming, we have no way of knowing since the lines of communication are blocked off, but look at how hard the Romans are working. They must be scared. They must have reason to be working this hard.
They must know something we don't know. And if they know it, then we need to believe that it's going to happen.
Right. We need to hold out because they're coming. Then he goes on to say this, quote, what therefore is my design line to do as our ancestors did in the war against the Cimbri and the Teutones, who, when driven into their towns and oppressed by similar privations, supported life by the corpses of those who appeared useless for war. The Cimbri, after laying Gaul to waste and inflicting great calamities, at length departed from our country and sought other lands. They left us our rights, laws, lands, and liberty. But what other motive or wish have the Romans than to settle in the lands of those they have conquered and impose on them perpetual slavery? For they never have carried on wars on any other terms. Look to the neighboring Gaul, which being reduced to the form of a province, stripped of its rights and laws, and subjected to Roman despotism, is oppressed by perpetual slavery. I mean, this is just an incredible speech. He's calling for cannibalism. He's saying we've got to hold out because we can't let our friends and family show up and just find all of our bodies here and risk their lives over that. And the only way we can hold out is by killing the people who are not warriors to support the warriors.
It's absolutely horrifying. It's such a horrifying choice to make. And my heart's a little bit broken already. I know what's going to happen. This is not for the faint of heart, this episode.
Yeah. And he reminds them of the stakes. Loss of society, loss of home, loss of family, loss of everything they are, perpetual slavery.
Instead of agreeing to cannibalism, Vercingetorix opened the gates and put the non-combatants out of the city into the no man's land between Alesia's ramparts and the Roman wall. These were the original citizens of Alesia, the people who'd let the army into their town in the first place. Women, children, non-combatants, the elderly, the sick, all those who couldn't fight, starving and defenseless, they went to the inner Roman wall to be taken as slaves or just allowed to pass through the territory. And you can sort of see that from Vercingetorix's point of view. This was giving them the best possible chance. If they stayed in the town, they'd starve, if they weren't killed and eaten first. People were already calling for the non-combatants to be killed for food. The Romans were known for taking slaves, and while that would be an absolutely horrible fate, at least the civilians would be fed and have a chance at being alive.
Right, and we're not saying that being taken as a slave is in any way a good fate at all. That is a terrible fate. And obviously Vercingetorix wouldn't have wanted that, but he was faced with an impossible choice.
He was faced with, my men are going to eat the women and children of this city that let us in with open arms. So the only way that I can remove that temptation from them and these aggrandizing speeches about what we should do with cannibalism is to put these people out of my walls.
And I just hope that the Romans show a sliver of mercy. Not to say that slave taking is merciful.
Yeah, because these are women and children. 80,000 men showed up at their gates, and really, they said, let them in, and what were their options? Not let them in? How are they going to fight them off? I mean, it's impossible.
Right, everybody is stuck in a horrible situation here.
But the Romans had their own mouths to feed, and they said no thanks, and kept their own gates shut. And the women, children, sick and elderly of Alesia were left to die of exposure or starvation in the no man's land between the Roman fortifications and the walls of their own town.
Yeah, so this is the part of the battle I could never get out of my head. Thousands of women and children and non-combatants haunting this space between walls as the battle raged around them. It gets surprisingly little attention. I first found out about it when I visited Alesia, which is in France. You can visit it. And if you go there today, I remember I went there on this beautiful sunny day. It was in May or something. There's a really nice interpretive center. There's some reconstructed earthworks and walls and things. It's kind of just a big field now. And I remember walking through this interpretive center and reading all the plaques because I love a good interpretive plaque. And there was a sentence about it somewhere in the museum, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And I don't know what happened to these people. And I watched at least one documentary that states that Vercingetorix relented after a while and let the civilians back in. Caesar in his commentaries doesn't mention what happened to the people, and Cassius Dio tells us, quote, "These perished most miserably between the city and the camp because neither party would receive them." And I don't know, Jen, I feel like, okay, what do we know about Vercingetorix? I think he would be ruthless enough to stay resolute here and not let the civilians back in.
I don't know that it's even ruthless at this point. What is the alternative? By letting the civilians in, his men will absolutely cook and eat them. They are starving. These people are useless to them, and they are really concerned that the only way that they're going to win and hold out for this other army is if they keep up their strength. So they're going to commit atrocities if he lets them back in. There is nothing in the city to eat. You get to a point where you can't even boil your horse saddle. You get to a point where even that's gone. And also, there's probably a lot of nutritional deficiencies, which do impact the brain and make you think things that you might not otherwise think.
And we know from the How to Survive a Siege episodes that this is a pretty common thing that would happen, is that eventually the starving people inside a city would resort to cannibalism. It was not even unusual.
So, and then 3 days later, just as they had lost all hope, the defenders warriors of Alesia woke up to an incredible sight. The great army of free Gaul, 258,000 strong, filled the Elysian plain beyond the Roman defenses. The reinforcements had arrived, but not in time to save the people trapped in between the walls. I just want to stress that again. Those people, done for.
Whatever happens next, remember that there are civilians in the no man's land between the city and the inner Roman defenses. They're there the whole time, even when there's a battle going on.
This enormous army was made up of an alliance of dozens of tribes, some of which had until recently fought for Caesar. It was led by 4 chieftains, one of whom was Vercingetorix's cousin. Another, Commius, had been a loyal ally of Caesar as recently as last year. He had actually been appointed king of his tribe by Caesar himself. But now he's on Vercingetorix's team.
Speaking of Caesar, he'd finished with his defenses by now, and here's what the united armies of free Gaul would have to face to reach the Elysian defenders. Caesar's army was enclosed by walls on both sides, an inner wall to blockade the defenders, and an outer wall to keep out the reinforcements. And long before the reinforcements got to that outer wall, they'd have to navigate a vast plain studded with caltrops and spikes hung with iron hooks, and 5-foot-deep pits lined with sharpened stakes at the bottom, camouflaged with leaves and branches on top. Caesar's troops had given these cute little nicknames. The pits were lilies because of the greenery at the top. The hook spikes were called spurs. I guess these were probably catchier in Latin.
Probably, or there was probably some double entendre there.
Right, there's some kind of double entendre that we're completely missing. So the caltrops, by the way, I just have to talk about these. These are an ancient anti-personnel device. They're kind of I don't know how to describe them. They're like a little spiky thingy, right? They're a thingy.
They're like a little tripod of death.
Right, that's actually a really good way to describe it. They're made up of 4 sharp nails, all pointing in different directions, so that no matter which way the caltrops falls, one of the nails is always pointing up. If you have enough of them, they're crippling against both infantry and cavalry.
Whoever made it through the booby traps alive without breaking their horse's legs or getting impaled on stakes would then have to navigate a system of 3 trenches. The outer one, 15 feet wide, the middle one flooded with water diverted from a nearby river, and an inner one 20 feet wide and 20 feet deep, with sides straight up and down, all while taking heavy fire from the Roman artillery towers built every 80 yards along the outer Roman wall.
You know what we need here, Jen? I think we need someone who can do the salmon leap.
Exactly! Oh, where's Cuchulainn when we need him?
Where are all of the salmon leapers in this army?
Relegated to mythology, Jenny Williamson.
Sorry to hear that.
Sorry, I'm also in ancient Ireland.
Time and space and reality. That is where the salmon leapers are.
If the Gauls on the outside, and we're going to call them the outside Gauls because it gets really confusing really quickly. So if the outside Gauls did reach that outer wall, they'd find it was built on a tall earthen rampart. And in front of it, the Romans had driven several lines of fire-hardened stakes into the ground, all pointing upward at an angle toward an incoming charge. It looked grim and also pointy. Alesia was kind of very pointy at this point in time.
The outside Gauls immediately took the offensive with a great roar to alert the defenders to their plan, the defenders being the inside Gauls, who are inside the city. The sight of them filling the plain for miles must have filled the inside Gauls with a renewed will to fight. In response, Vercingetorix sent his own warriors out of the town and toward the inner Roman wall. The plan was to coordinate a joint attack on the outer and inner defenses. The battle raged from noon to sunset amidst a thick, deadly hail of slings and arrows from both sides. There was no clear winner until Caesar sent in his German cavalry at the last minute. The inside Gauls were driven back into the town, and the outside Gauls back from the walls.
I mean, the German cavalry strikes again.
We've got to talk about the German cavalry at this point, right? There are actually 2 specific things about this battle I want to unpack here, and the first one is the German cavalry. They've shown up twice before in this episode, once beating the Gallic cavalry back from Caesar's supply lines, and again driving them away from the Roman defenses at Alesia. The pattern is this. Caesar holds them back until the last minute, and just when it looks like he's lost, he sends them in to save the day. And one thing you have to remember here is that the Roman army isn't just made up of Romans. There are a lot of Gallic auxiliaries here, recruited from allies. There are maybe 3 Roman allies left in Free Gaul at this point, and members of the Roman army army proper, mostly Gauls living in Cisalpine or Transalpine Gaul, which remember are Roman provinces. And finally, there are hostages from different tribes who've been forced to fight for the Romans. Some of those might have had Stockholm syndrome by this point. And remember, Caesar has been sort of gallivanting around northern Gaul, taking all these hostages from prominent families. So some of them are members of those families. And then there were the Germans.
These Germans were recruited from defeated tribes Caesar had encountered on his 6-year rampage throughout Gaul. He's the worst. I feel like I can't just say it enough. Some of the Germans were traveling mercenaries, looking for wealth and glory by fighting for a strong chieftain, Roman or Gallic. It didn't matter to them as long as they were winning and presumably being paid. Others had originally been hostages. Some were from the Suevi, Ariovistus's people, battle-hardened tribesmen, heavily armed and superb horseback riders.
Right, we talked about them in the first episode on the Gallic Wars.
Caesar had started assembling them his first year in Gaul, probably from hostages he took from Ariovistus's Suevi. He liked them so much he replaced their small, tough little ponies! I love tough little ponies. With larger, tougher horses used in his own cavalry. And this was basically supercharging them. There were between 400 and 1,000 of these elite cavalry, not many compared to the vast numbers deployed in this conflict, but they were lethal fighters who worked in perfect concert, and they saved Caesar's ass again and again and again and again, and they were also kind of show-offs. I mean, you're comparing these big, fancy horses that are kind of like literally dancing rings at this point in time around the little Gallic ponies. To me, I love the tough little ponies, but like Caesar's horses, they feel like kind of show-offs to me. Like they feel like dressage horses.
Right, so imagine that these are between 400 and 1,000 German dressage riders. Obviously, the Gauls have no chance because dressage, right? Like horse dancing, it's like a lot of complicated maneuvers that you do on a horse, and it actually has its basis in the maneuvers that people used to train their horses for during war.
Really?
Yeah, so it's actually not that far off. To say that these might have been Germanic dressage cavalry.
Do you mean like I actually made a point that wasn't as ridiculous as it sounded in my head?
No, it actually kind of made a little bit of sense.
Oh man, guys.
Every so often the things that are just in the tops of our heads make a little bit of sense. I'm not going to say they make a lot of sense.
These were horses that were really able to maneuver a lot better. They were a lot bigger than the Gallic cavalry.
And more endurance, maybe? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and they would have been terrifying. And also, remember, the Gallic numbers are kind of limited. And then all of a sudden, they think they're winning. And Caesar's like, oh, guys, you remember these horses? You remember these soldiers? They're back again. Because I know you can't beat them. And then they come out with their ribbons and their wonderful music blaring as they win all the golds.
And their tops and tails, formal attire. It is a bad scene. Okay. So that's the German cavalry. There's another thing I want to mention here, and that is the shouting. All the shouting, right? So in this battle, we have two Gallic armies. The army within and the army without, the outside Gauls and the inside Gauls. And between them, we have the Roman lines, which are completely locked down. There's no communication getting back and forth. So how did these two armies communicate to coordinate their attacks? You see them doing it in the commentaries actually by shouting at each other. And that isn't as ridiculous as it sounds.
It's not?
It's really not. Because as we said, they were separated by the Roman lines and all these giant walls and ditches and booby traps and stuff. But even so, 250,000 people all screaming at once can make a lot of noise. But here's another detail that I just love. The commentaries also mention trumpets. And I recognize this. These can be none other than the legendary carnix.
Yes.
Right? The enormous wind instruments, as many as 12 feet long, that the Gauls used to communicate in battle. We've already included this quote in our episode about the Gauls that I'm about to read you, but it's worth repeating the sound of the carnix in battle from someone who was there, Polybius, a Greek chronicler who died about 18 years before Caesar was born. He traveled in Gaul before the Gallic Wars, and at some point, he must have stood close enough to a Gallic army in battle to be deafened by the sound. Here's how he describes it. Quote, "There were countless trumpeters and horn blowers, and since the whole army was shouting its war cries at the same time, there was such a confused sound that the noise seemed to come not only from the trumpeters and the soldiers, but also from the countryside, which was joining in the echo."
This must have been the sound of the Gallic army from within and from without. On all sides, the Romans would have been surrounded by the sounds of their enemies, screams and battle cries, and beneath it all the booming song of trumpets shaking the earth, as if the land itself had risen up in rebellion. Think of how the ground would have shook.
Yeah, think of the walls of Alesia. The sound of these trumpets, like the earth echoing off of these walls and just booming down into that valley.
Yeah, and everything would have been just so echoed because the Romans had built themselves into this little, like, tiny space. I mean, it wasn't that tiny, but you know what I mean.
Well, they'd built themselves with these walls on both sides that must have just been an echo chamber.
So that was the first battle. The Gauls were defeated, but they weren't deterred. The outside Gauls retreated to their camp at sunset. There, they regrouped and spent hours building what they would need for their next attempt: ladders, hurdles, and iron grappling hooks. Then, the outside Gauls moved at midnight under the cover of dark, sneaking up beneath the Roman walls. Just before the attack, they raised an immense shout, alerting the inside Gauls to mount a joint attack.
And here again, you see the communication problem these two armies had. Vercingetorix had no way of knowing what his people on the outside were doing. He had to scramble to respond. He ordered his corneces played to alert his own troop to attack at the same point in the Roman internal line, and the great booming war cry of the Carnacs echoed from the walls of Alesia, telling the defenders to mobilize. Meanwhile, the outside Gauls were scaling the Roman wall under a heavy hail of slings, stones, spears, and arrows. But the attack wasn't as effective as it could have been because Vercingetorix couldn't mobilize his own troops fast enough on the other side.
So here's where Caesar's booby traps were starting to bite. The outside Gauls were stepping on the caltraps and falling into pits lined with stakes. Many of these were concealed by foliage. Thousands of men and horses were impaled and had to be left behind to die a horrible death in the pits as the outside Gauls were forced to retreat. The screams echoing off that battlefield must have been blood-curdling. The outside Gauls, despite outnumbering and surrounding the Romans, were getting their asses handed to them. They had to do better. They retreated into camp once again, and before they made a new plan, they consulted with people who knew the lay of the land, captives and deserters from the Roman army. They found out there was a weak point in the outer wall, a gap where an inconveniently placed hill interrupted the Roman line. Vercingetorix's cousin led 60,000 hand-picked men, the best of the best. They snuck around the place where the wall broke. I guess 60,000 men can sneak around? I don't know. They were all professional sneakers.
They were all professional sneakers. There were 60,000 of them handpicked for their sneaking ability.
These 60,000 professional sneakers were sneaking around while the rest of the army launched distractionary attacks elsewhere along the walls.
So, for some reason, like I said, the Romans didn't notice the 60,000 men just decamping to the most vulnerable spot on their walls because these were professional sneakers and they did not fuck around.
They did not fuck around.
Nope, nobody in this episode fucks around.
Maybe Caesar was like, I'm just going to let the German cavalry do some dressage for a bit.
Well, maybe they're just busy with their dressage competition inside the wall. Anyway, Vercingetorix, however, was occupying higher ground than the Romans did, and he noticed because he was paying attention. He didn't know exactly what his cousin had planned. That's one of the leaders of the outside Gaul army, but he could guess. He readied his own army, arming them with long hooks and siege-breaking weapons. It went down at high noon. Both sides attacked at once, where the Roman lines were the most vulnerable. The Romans were caught off guard, strung out along a 14-mile circle. Their army spread out to counterattacks in various places. They had to scramble. The scene was one of chaos. Roman soldiers were running everywhere. The outside Gauls were heaping up enormous earthen ramps to get over the walls and bypass the booby traps. The defenses were starting to break, and the Roman troops were hanging by a thread.
Meanwhile, Vercingetorix was personally leading the attack from the inside, tearing down ramparts and breastworks, knocking defenders out of turrets with a hail of arrows and slingstones, and generally raising hell. And Caesar knew this time he couldn't just lead from afar. He had to join the fray as well. Quote,
"Hold up, Caesar has something aggrandizing to say."
Here we go. It's from the commentaries, guys.
Jen, why don't you hit us with some Caesar talking about himself in the third person?
Oh, can I? Might I have that privilege?
No, please do. Be my guest.
Okay. Quote, his arrival was known through the color of his cloak, which he always wore in battle as a distinguishing mark, and the troops of cavalry and the cohorts which he had ordered to follow him were also visible, because from the higher parts of the hill, these downward slopes and dips could be seen.
Tell us about the slopes and dips, Caesar.
They're downward. I'm still quoting here, guys. Then the enemy joined battle. Both sides cheered, and the cry was taken up by a shout from the men within the fortifications and ramparts. And I have to say, both sides cheered. Can we just
stop and talk about that?
Yeah.
So Caesar is saying that even the Gauls were cheering because Caesar has entered the fray.
apparently, Caesar's arrival just turns the tide of battle.
Everyone's so glad to see him, even the Gauls.
Everyone is so glad. At this point, we're again reminding you this is from the commentaries written in third person, which, Caesar was writing about himself as it was happening.
Of course, he's going to tell everyone that this is what happened.
Exactly. So a great slaughter ensued of 60,000 Gallic picked men, the best of the best. Few made it back to their camp alive, but of course they cheered when Caesar got on the battlefield.
I mean, because it meant an honorable death was imminent.
Yeah, and I can kind of believe that. I can kind of believe that they would be like, fine, at least we've done so much to antagonize Caesar that the coward has to come out from behind his walls and face us man to man. Maybe that's what he means here.
Or maybe they're cheering at a chance to beat up on this guy. I mean, that makes sense too.
Maybe. But I also just don't believe that they cheered because he came out in his fancy red cloak or whatever the hell he was wearing.
I mean, I think that Caesar's doing a little bit of aggrandizing here is what I think.
I mean, no.
Shocker.
Nobody writes about themselves in the third person to be anything other than modest, Jenny.
He's just telling it like it is. Just the facts.
Yes, and he's removed himself from the story and he's made himself third person so that he can be as modest as humanly possible.
It's completely dispassionate and not subjective at all?
No, and there is no aggrandizement happening.
Not at all.
If you can't get that sarcasm, guys, I can't.
Sarcasm dripping from your earbuds.
Like my Imbuza poison.
Jen's Imbuza poison is actually just sarcasm. So Vercingetorix called another tribal meeting, and these meetings were getting increasingly tense, which is possibly the understatement of the century. The reality was this. They were out of food. 3 times the reinforcements had battered themselves against the Roman ramparts, and 3 times they'd limped home, torn and bloody. There was no way an army that size could stay in the field with the landscape already burned out and picked clean. The fight was over. The only chance was to surrender and hope for favorable terms. Vercingetorix said, quote, that he had undertaken that war not on account of his own exigencies, but on account of their freedom, and since he must yield to fortune, he offered himself to them for either purpose, whether they should wish to atone to the Romans by his death or surrender him alive.
Vercingetorix then took the initiative and opened negotiations for surrender. He sent ambassadors to Caesar, ordered his chieftains to throw down their arms, and rode out of the lost city with his head held high. Caesar doesn't describe the scene of Vercingetorix's surrender in his commentaries. He needs Vercingetorix to look just heroic enough to aggrandize Caesar by his defeat, but not so heroic as to upstage him. But luckily, here's where Plutarch has our backs.
A lot of the other ancient writers who tell us about the commentaries, there's Plutarch, there's Suetonius, there's Cassius Dio, for example. A lot of those writers are basically drawing from the commentaries to tell us about Caesar's time in Gaul, and you can see the influence there. But every so often you come across a detail that one of them gives us that isn't from the commentaries, and this is one of them. It's a rare and important detail that we actually don't get from Caesar.
Quote, and the leader of the whole war, Vercingetorix, after putting on his most beautiful armor and decorating his horse, rode out through the gate. He made a circuit around Caesar, who remained seated, and then leaped down from his horse, stripped off his suit of armor, and seating himself at Caesar's feet, remained motionless until he was delivered up to be kept in custody for the triumph. And I can just imagine what that scene would have looked like. Vercingetorix comes out in the shining armor, his mustache is glorious and waxed, and he is proud and he is unbroken, and he circles around Caesar, and then he jumps off his horse, and he does the only thing he can do in this situation. He strips off his armor, he lays down his weapons, and says, okay, we surrender.
He's giving his people some dignity to take with them. Like, they're surrendering, but they're not broken.
Exactly. And he's not going out in bloody armor. He's not going out looking haggard. He's going out looking put together and like the epic warrior king he was.
Sometimes Vercingetorix is a little bit difficult because he's forced to make such brutal decisions, but then you come across a detail like this and it's so amazingly courageous and selfless because he's basically sacrificing himself.
He's like, well, maybe the Romans will take me and give you guys some mercy.
Yeah.
So after this, the rest of the rebellious tribes fell like dominoes before the might of Rome. Everyone capitulated, including the Aedui and the Iverni. Caesar stationed his legions throughout Gaul and declared the whole of it a Roman province. Back in Rome, the Senate was so pleased it declared a 20-day holiday to celebrate Caesar's victories. Of those Gallic forces who defied Caesar, most of these were killed or sold into slavery. Caesar returned over 20,000 captives to the Aedui and Iverni, but Vercingetorix was not so lucky. He was bound in chains and sent back to Rome, where he was imprisoned for 6 years.
For 6 years, Vercingetorix was imprisoned in the Tullianum, the Mamertine prison, the horrible hole in the ground that used to be a cistern for a spring, where Rome's most infamous enemies were strangled. This was a big, powerful person who lived this powerful life, and to just have the last 6 years of it be so constricted is just horrifying to me.
The Vercingetorix who came out of that hole 6 years later, who would have been put in armor to make him look like this fierce Gallic warlord, would look nothing like the Vercingetorix who'd actually gone into that prison.
No, he wouldn't have been treated well. And I actually think I read somewhere, I'm not sure where, and I tried to look this up again and couldn't find it, but I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that when Caesar actually did have his triumph, he was mad at his prison keepers, Vercingetorix's prison keepers, because they hadn't kept him in very good condition, and now he wouldn't look all fierce for the parade.
Exactly, and that was a huge disrespect to Caesar's honor.
Right, because it's about Caesar.
Because it's all about Caesar. It's not about him at all. And when we did the research for the Stark family, this reminds me of what happened to Drusus, the one who was put into prison and he was starved to death and he resorted to eating his mattress stuffing. And there was a time when they were like, well, we don't actually think he did anything that bad. We could just let him go. And the Senate universally said, we actually can't, because what's been done to him, we don't think he can go out into the world anymore.
Well, we don't want the public to see him because it's just so horrific what's happened to him.
And he was next in line to be an emperor.
Right, and that was after only 2 years. Vercingetorix had to deal with this shit for 6 years. So that's another thing I just carry with me for some reason. Vercingetorix in the horrible hole for 6 years.
Well, and also he knew that by surrendering to Caesar, he would be at the mercy of Caesar. And we looked at the Gallic culture, and the Gallic culture was all about having an honorable death in battle. To actually leave himself to be deprived of that honorable death in battle and then spend 6 years languishing in a hole where he can't see the sky, it probably was his nightmare.
Yeah, but it shows the depth of his selflessness in that moment. Also, he was doing this because he was hoping that by this act of surrender, Caesar would be more merciful to his people. And it's possible that the reason Caesar surrendered those 20,000 captives back to the Aedui and the Arverni was because of Vercingetorix's sacrifice. It made him feel more charitable towards those people. I don't know. There isn't a direct line in the sources about that, but you could imagine.
Maybe. I hope that's the case. It's impossible for us to know.
And you can go visit the Mamertine prison still today. I haven't been there, and I'm getting my info about what it's like from written sources and pictures on the internet, so there might be people who are listening to this right now and who've been there and who might know a little bit more about this than me. But from what I understand, there were 2 chambers in the Mamertine prison around Caesar's time. The horrible hole and the chamber just above it, which probably wasn't much better. Sallust, a chronicler who was alive during Caesar's lifetime, describes the prison like this, quote, "In the prison, when you have gone up a little way toward the left, there is a place called the Tullianum, about 12 feet below the surface of the ground. It's enclosed on all sides by walls, and above it is a chamber with a vaulted roof of stone. Neglect, darkness, and stench make it hideous and fearsome to behold."
It wasn't meant for long-term imprisonment. It was meant to be a place of execution. But Vercingetorix was kept there for 6 years. He got to see the sky again briefly when he was led through the streets in chains during Caesar's triumph in 46 BC. Then he was lowered back down into the black pit of the Mamertine prison, where he was ritually strangled. And this ritual strangulation, you have to explain it to me. I don't understand it.
We definitely got a little wrapped around the axle about the ritual strangulation in our last episode that talks about this, which was Julius Caesar and the Devil Three-Way, when we talked about it during the Catiline conspiracy. And I actually found some information, Jen, that might answer your questions about it and my questions.
Thank you.
Right. So we were both kind of wrapped around the axle about this ritual strangulation the last time it came up.
One of us more so than the other one.
I got really into it as well, and it really just kind of gnawed at me. It's like, what is ritual strangulation? How does this differ from regular strangulation? I mean, I'm not seeing anyone else particularly interested in this. Maybe there are people out there who know about sources that I don't know about, but the translations of ancient sources really don't provide a lot of detail on this, and I didn't see much scholarship on the ritual strangulation in modern sources I was looking at either. The only place I could find someone else really interested in the ritual strangulation was on a blog. Take this with a grain of salt, like everything in this podcast, but this is from a website called Illustra Monumentum Est, an Antipodean view on classical Greece, Rome, and the Mediterranean and it's written by someone named Scott McPhee. Scott McPhee, according to his website, is a PhD student in ancient history and classics at the School of History, Philosophy, Religion, and Classics at the University of Queensland. So he knows a lot more about this stuff than we do. This isn't about Vercingetorix. It's actually from the original Latin of Sallust. He's a really valuable source because he lived during Caesar's time. He's talking about the executions in the Catiline conspiracy. If you listen to Julius Caesar and the Devil's Three-Way, that's where we talk about the Catiline conspiracy in more detail. What you need to know for the purposes of this is that the Catiline conspirators were executed exactly as Vercingetorix was, and in the same place, lowered down into the black, gaping mouth of the Mamertine prison and ritually strangled in the dark. Scott McPhee approaches it not from the archaeology, not from carvings or ancient writers in translation. Instead, what he does is he finds clues about what went on with the ritual strangulation in the Latin language itself. And I found this so fascinating because I've never seen anyone else care this much about the ritual strangulation, and I just had to share it with you guys. And it's kind of a long passage, and we have to quote the whole thing because of the specifics of the Latin language that he gets into. So I really hope, Scott McPhee, if you're listening somewhere, that you don't mind. Immense shout out, and we will link to you in the show notes. But we just felt the need to share this because we think it was so great. So this is a quote from Scott McPhee. Quote, "It's funny sometimes how Latin terms are glossed. Consider Sallust," and this is me attempting to pronounce Latin. This is what he says about the Catiline conspiracy. This is a quote within the quote. "In eum locum postquam demissus est Lentulus, vindices rerum capitalium, quibus preceptum erat laqueo gulam fragere." This is typically translated as something like the following. "When Lentulus had been let down into this place, executioners, to whom orders had been given, strangled him with a cord." So this is still Scott McPhee. He says, "The translation above is almost exactly the one on Perseus, which is the site where we get all the free translations, which is the 1899 English translation by J.S. Watson. But he has glossed over the words executioners above as certain men. But even then, the word executioners is a certain type of gloss. The Latin in question is vindices rerum capitalium, which is far more literally something like the revengers of the capital matters, or perhaps more favorably, but still rather cryptic, capital revengers. Anyway, this is where we get the idea of capital punishment or capital crimes from. So capital revengers, which is a really interesting turn of phrase. So he goes on to say this, quote, "A strange turn of phrase, perhaps, but how exactly did Lentulus die at the illegal order of Cicero?" And remember, Cicero was the one who ordered the conspirators executed without trial. So that's what he's talking about. Is that strangled with a cord? Well, yes, but no. In fact, it's far more brutal than that. So this next passage, he really goes into it, and we are still quoting Scott McPhee here. Enormous shout out to this guy. I did not write this. Quote, "The Latin words for the method of execution are laqueo gulam frigere. Laqueo is ablative laqueus, meaning noose, snare, etc. Let's say by a noose. Gulam is straightforward. It's accusative gula, the throat or neck. Now that leaves the verb frigere. Oh yes, perhaps strangled, but not exactly. There's some typical archaizing going on here by Sallust that's altered the form of the verb somewhat. It's really frango, frangere, fregi, fractum, and look at that supine, fractum, which is where we ultimately derive the word fracture. And indeed, frango means more like break, crush, grind, bruise, and also by transference, violate, subdue, soften, and weaken. Lentulus is having his throat violated. This being ancient Rome, it's not a noose breaking the neck as in a 19th century long drop hanging. It's a rather brutal garroting, pure and simple. Again, this is more Scott McPhee. So sure, while it might be fine to think that certain men strangled him with a cord, but that makes it sound rather more pleasant a death than the way it surely was, and Sallust had just finished describing how disgusting in darkness, filth, and smell the dungeon where the execution took place actually was. Therefore, I think it's far more fitting to think that in the dark and fetid pit of the Tullianum, that the capital revengers crushed his throat with a noose. So, Jen, does that answer your questions from the last time we talked about the horrible hole?
No!
It doesn't? Why not?
Because how did the strangling person get down there? Like, this is my big thing. Like, you put someone into the hole, and, like, they're supposed to die in this horrible hole. They're stinky, there's no sky, etc. But who's the guy with the noose? And how did they get down there, and how did they get out?
Okay, so the capital revenger is the guy with the noose. And as for how they got in, I mean, I don't know. But I'm assuming there's, like, a ladder or, like, a rope. I mean, this isn't the most important part of this story, Jen, like how they got down there.
Okay, so then you killed all these people because somehow, magically.
Not magically, it's with a cord.
It's in the dark. You don't know who you're actually strangling because it's so dark. What if they get the cord and they just strangle you and then they pull on the little rope and are like, all right, bring me up. And actually, there's someone who is supposed to be in the hole.
So you mean what if the prisoner strangles the executioner by accident?
Well, they wouldn't be doing it on accident. They'd definitely be doing it on purpose.
Oh, or like just they turn the tables. I mean, I would love it if that actually happened, but I don't think that happened.
I mean, it probably didn't because the prisoners were so weak and were probably like, please kill me.
Gosh, that's a horrible, depressing thought.
Well, we've gone into the Mamertine prison. What did you think was going to happen?
Right. It's depressing down there. I mean, here's a thought, Jen. What if once you're a capital revenger, right? You go down in the horrible pit, you strangle the person you're supposed to strangle, and then they don't let you up because somebody always has to be in the horrible hole.
Oh, that is terrifying.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Praetorian Guard, and there always has to be an emperor, so if there isn't one, they have to make one.
So guys, here's the thing. What are the ancient history fangirl rules? Don't work for the Carthaginians. There's no gift basket good enough.
If the elephants are drinking, you should also drink.
And do not take the job as a capital revenger and get lowered into a hole and assume you will be brought back out.
Someone is like hiring capital revengers on Craigslist or something. Don't answer the call.
And also, if you're keeping a fox in your shirt, tell someone.
Right. Tell someone. It's still a mystery as to how the capital revengers got into the hole, but I think we've solved a few problems.
Okay. And what happened to the rest of Gaul? It was, as Caesar described in his commentaries, divided into 3 parts. During the 8 years Caesar was in Gaul, his actions led to the death of approximately 1 million people, not counting those who later died of disease or famine. The enslavement of 1 million more. By some estimates, as many as 1 in 4 people in France and Belgium were killed or enslaved in this conflict. Somewhere in south-central France, just outside the Arverni territory, an unnamed group of Gauls broke and buried an enormous cache, over 12 swords, iron spearheads, scabbards, shields, 10 bronze helmets, iron animal sculptures, a cauldron, and 7 great carcasses, all broken into more than 500 pieces, as was the custom for sacrifices to the gods. Perhaps all the treasure of a once noble Gallic family, or small tribe that had been defeated in Caesar's wars. It would not see the light of day again until 2004. And as for those who survived and weren't enslaved, Gaul would stay a province of Rome for about 538 years. Soon after Caesar's conquest, the children of prominent chieftains were sent as hostages to Rome in the thousands, and they came back Romanized, if they came back at all.
In the coming centuries, Gaul was Romanized. The ancient culture of pre-Roman Gaul melded with that of the conqueror to become something new, Gallo-Roman culture. This culture dominated all levels of society. The religion of the Druids was suppressed, went underground, and eventually vanished, along with all the knowledge the Druids carried in their heads. Their ancient epic stories, myths, and songs disappeared from memory. Their language was dead by the 6th century AD. It combined with Latin and eventually evolved into a new Romance language, which became French. Gallic religion melded with Roman religion until you could barely see more than the contours of what had been before.
Gallic people began writing things down, using the Greek and Roman alphabet. It's here that most of our inscriptions of the Gallic language come from. Rich Romans built villas in Gaul, similar to those in Italy, supplanting the traditional Celtic houses. One assumes they froze in the winter.
Yeah, because not the same environment.
The Romans divided Gaul into 3 large provinces, and then further divided those provinces into smaller and smaller units, culminating in the pagae, a word that evolved into the French word pays, which means countryside. These more or less corresponded to older tribal divisions. These Roman divisions would eventually be used as the template for ecclesiastical dioceses that came later with Christianity. The map would stay more or less unchanged for almost 2,000 years until the French Revolution, starting in 1789.
The pagae may have been based loosely on ancient tribal boundaries, but they were ruled in the Roman fashion, with Roman leaders and Roman administrative practices. No more could Gallic leaders seize their own destiny. Military glory was to be had only by fighting in Roman wars, and families sent their sons to fight in the legions. Slowly, as the region adopted Roman language and customs, what had been before was plowed under. Cuchulainn was dead. Vercingetorix was dead. The named and nameless heroes of La Tène were dead. They had done everything they possibly could. Woe, as Brennus would say, to the vanquished.
So that's it for this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks. And in the meantime, come and find us on Twitter, Ancient Hist or Instagram and Facebook, Ancient History Fangirl.
And check out our Patreon. We mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, and we're going to bring it up again. Your support through the Patreon makes a world of difference to us. We're hoping it'll someday give us the freedom to prioritize the podcast, to invest more in this podcast, and bring you more content.
Yeah. Don't you want more episodes from us? I think you do.
Yeah, more uplifting episodes about the ancient world.
I'm going to pick an uplifting episode.
Are you, though? I mean, I know what's on your docket.
There are some very uplifting moments. The beginnings of my episodes are always uplifting.
I'm not going to necessarily refute that, but I don't know that I agree.
Anyway, you can also show your support in other ways. Visit our Ko-Fi account and kick us a few bucks or leave us a nice review. Reviews really matter. They help us move up the algorithms in whatever podcatcher you're listening to us on. And, they make us smile.
It helps keep our morale up.
They really do. The amount of times one or the other will text each other, usually at a ridiculously late time in their time zone, being like, oh my God, we just saw this amazing thing. It really helps keep us going. If you don't want to leave reviews, tell a friend, tell two. We're still building our audience and every little bit helps. And we appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you in 2 weeks.